Chapter 13. When Mr. Ferguson said good night, David, apparently unable to find the book he had promised to take into Elizabeth, made no effort to help his mother in her usual small nightly tasks of blowing out the lamps, tidying the table, folding up a newspaper or two. This was not like David, but Mrs. Ritchie was too absorbed to notice her son's absorption. Just as she was starting upstairs, he burst out, "Materna." "Yes, what is it?" He gave her a keenly searching look, then drew a breath of relief and kissed her. "Nothing," he said. But later, as he lay on his back in bed, his hands clasped behind his head, his pipe between his teeth, David was distinctly angry. Of course she doesn't care a hang for him, he reflected. I could see that, but I swear I'll go to Philadelphia right off. Before he slept he had made up his mind that was the best thing to do. That old man, grey and granite-faced, and silent, that old codger, said the disrespectful cub of 26, should take advantage of friendship to be a nuisance, confound him. Said David. The idea of his daring to make love to her. I wanted to show him the door. As for his mother, even if she didn't care a hang, he was half shocked, half hurt. He felt, as all young creatures do, a curious repulsion at the idea of love-making between people no longer young. It hurt his delicacy, it almost hurt his sense of reverence for his mother, to think that she had been obliged to listen to any words of love. "It's offensive," he said angrily. "Yes, we'll clear out. We'll go to Philadelphia the 1st of March, instead of April." The next morning he suggested his plan to his mother. "Could you pack up in 3 weeks, Materna?" he said. "I think I'd like to get you settled before I go to the hospital." Mrs. Ritchie's instant acceptance of the change of date made him more annoyed than ever. He has worried her, he thought angrily. I wonder how long this thing has been going on? But he said nothing to her. Nor did he mean to explain to Elizabeth just why he must shorten their last few weeks of being together. It would not be fair to his mother to explain, he said to himself. He did not think of any unfairness to the old codger. He was, however, a little uneasy at the prospect of breaking the fact of this earlier departure to Elizabeth without an explanation. Elizabeth might be hurt, she might say that he didn't want to stay with her. She knows better, he said to himself, grinning. The honest truth was, and he faced it with placidity, that if things were not explained to Elizabeth, she might get huffy. This was David's word, but David knew how to check that huffiness. They were to walk together that afternoon, and he maneuvered for a few exquisite minutes alone before they went out. At first the moments were not very exquisite. "Well, what happened to you last night? I thought you were going to bring me that book." "I couldn't. I had to stay at home." "Why?" "Well, Materna wanted me." Elizabeth murmured a small, cold "oh." Then she said, "Why didn't you send the book in by Uncle?" "I didn't think of it," David said candidly. Elizabeth's dimple straightened. "It would have been polite to have sent me a message. I took it for granted you'd know I was detained." "You take too much for," she began, but before she could utter the sharp words that trembled on her lips, he caught her in his arms and kissed her. Instantly the little flame of temper was blown out. "That's the worst of walking," David said, as she let him draw her down on the sofa beside him. "I can't kiss you on the street." "Heavens, I should hope not," she said. Then, forgetting what she thought was his forgetfulness, she relaxed within his arms, sighing with bliss. "Oh, isn't it joyful, joyful, joyful," she hummed softly. "I do love to have you put your arms around me, David. Isn't it wonderful to love each other the way we do? I feel so sorry for other girls, because they aren't engaged to you, poor things. Do you suppose anybody in the world was ever as happy as I am?" "You?" said David, scornfully. "You don't count at all, compared to me." Then they both laughed for the sheer foolishness of that joyfulness, which was so often on Elizabeth's lips. But David sighed. 3 years is a devilish long time to wait. "Maybe it will be only 2. She whispered, her soft lips against his ear. But this was one of David's practical and responsible moments, so he said grimly, "Not much hope of that." Elizabeth, agreeing sadly, got up to straighten her hat before the mirror over the mantelpiece. "It's hideously long. Oh, if I were only a rich girl." "Thank heaven you are not," he said, with such sudden cold incisiveness that she turned round and looked at him. "Do you think I'd marry a rich woman, and let her support me?" I don't see why she shouldn't, if she loved you, Elizabeth said calmly. I don't see that it matters which has the money, the man or the girl. I see, David said. I've always felt that way, even about mother. Materna has wanted to help me out lots of times, and I wouldn't let her. I could kick myself now when I think how often I have to put my hand in her pocket. I think, cried Elizabeth, a man might love a girl enough to live on her money. I don't, David said, soberly. Well, said Elizabeth, don't worry. I haven't a cent, so you can't put your hand in my pocket. Come, we must start. I want to go and see Nanny for a minute, and Cherry Pie says I must be in before dark, because I have a cold. I like sitting here best, David confessed, but pulled himself up from the sofa, and in another minute Miss White, peering from an upper window, saw them walking off. Made for each other, said Cherry Pie, nibbling with happiness. They had almost reached Nanny's before David said that he was afraid he would have to go away a month before he had planned. When he was most in earnest, his usual brevity of speech fell into a curtness that might have seemed, to one who did not know him, indifference. Elizabeth did know him, but even to her the ensuing explanation, which did not explain, was through his very anxiety not to offend her, provokingly laconic. But you don't go on duty at the hospital until April, she said hotly. Why do you leave Mercer the 1st of March? Materna wants time to get settled. Mrs. Ritchie told me only yesterday that she was going to a hotel, Elizabeth said. She said she wasn't going to look for a house until the fall, because she will be at the seashore this summer. It certainly doesn't take a month to find a hotel. Well, the fact is, there are reasons why it isn't pleasant for Materna to be in Mercer just now. Not pleasant to be in Mercer. What on earth do you mean? I'm afraid I can't tell you. It's her affair. Oh, I didn't mean to intrude, Elizabeth said coldly. Now, Elizabeth, he protested, that isn't a nice thing to say. Do you think you've been saying nice things? I am perfectly certain that you would never hesitate to tell your mother any of my reasons for doing things. Elizabeth, I wouldn't leave Mercer a minute before the 1st of April, if I wasn't sure it was best for Materna. You know that. Oh, go, she said, go, and have all the secrets you want. I don't care. Elizabeth, be reasonable, But she had left him. They had reached the Maitland house, and, pushing aside his outstretched hand, she opened the iron gate herself, slammed it viciously, and ran up the curving steps to the door. As she waited for Harris to answer her ring, she looked back. I think you are reasonable enough for both of us. Please don't let me ever interfere with your plans. She paused a minute in the hall, listening for a following step. It did not come. Well, if he's cross he can stay outside, she told herself, and burst into the parlor. Nanny, she began. Oh, I beg your pardon, she said. Blair was standing on the hearthrug, talking vehemently to his sister. At the sound of the opening door he wheeled around and saw her, glowing, wounded, and amazingly handsome. Elizabeth, he said, staring at her. And he kept on staring while they shook hands. They were a handsome pair, the tall, dark, well-set-up man, and the girl almost as tall as he, with brown, guilt-flecked hair blowing about a vivid face which had the color, in the sharp February afternoon, of a blush rose. Where's David? Nanny said. Illustration. I think you are reasonable enough for both of us. I left him at the gate. He's coming in a minute, Elizabeth said, and turned to Blair. I didn't know you had come home. Blair explained that he was only in Mercer for a day. I'm in a hole, he said drolly, and I've come home to have Nanny get me out. Nanny is always ready to get people out of holes, Elizabeth said, but her voice was vague. She was listening for David's step, her cheeks beginning to burn with mortification at his delay. Where is David? Nanny demanded, returning from a fruitless search for him in the hall. He's a lucky dog, Blair said, looking at the charming, angry face with open and friendly admiration. Elizabeth shrugged her shoulders. I don't know about his luck. By the way, he is going to Philadelphia the 1st of March, Nanny, she said carelessly. I thought he didn't have to go until April? Nanny sympathized. So did I? Perhaps he'll tell you why he has changed his mind. He hasn't deigned to give me his reasons yet. And Blair, watching her, said to himself, same old Elizabeth. He began to talk to her in his gay, teasing way, but she was not listening. Suddenly she interrupted him, saying that she must go home. I thought David was coming in, but I suppose he's walking up and down, waiting for me. If he doesn't know which side his bread is buttered, I'll walk home with you, Blair said, and Nancy dear, while I'm gone, you see mother and do your best, won't you? Yes, poor Nanny sighed, but I do wish. Blair did not wait to hear what she wished. He had eyes only for this self-absorbed young creature who would not listen when he spoke to her. At the gate she hesitated, looked hurriedly about her, up and down the squalid street. She did not answer, did not apparently hear some question that he asked. Blair glanced up and down the street, too. David doesn't appreciate his opportunities, he said. Elizabeth's lip tightened, and she flung up her head. The rose in her cheeks was drowned in scarlet. She came out of her absorption, and began to sparkle at her companion. She teased him, but not too much. She flattered him, very delicately. She fell into half-sentimental reminiscences that made him laugh, then stabbed him gently with an indifferent word that showed how entirely she had forgotten him. And all the time her eyes were absent, and the straight line in her cheek held the dimple a prisoner. Blair, who had begun with a sort of good-natured, rather condescending amusement at his old playmate, found himself, to his surprise, on his mettle. Don't go home yet, he said. Let's take a walk. I'd love to. Mercer seems to be just as hideous as ever, Blair said. Suppose we go across the river, and get away from it? She agreed lightly. Horrid place. At the corner, she flashed a glance down the side street. David was not to be seen. Will David practice here, when he is ready to put out his shingle? I'm sure I don't know. I can't keep track of David's plans. He is just as good as ever, I suppose? Blair said, and watched her delicate lip droop. Better, if anything. And in the dusk, as they sauntered over the old bridge, she flung out jibe after jibe at her lover. Her cheeks grew hotter and hotter. It was like tearing her own flesh. The shame of it, the rapture of it, it hurt her so that the tears stood in her eyes, so she did it again, and yet again. I don't pretend to live up to David, she said. Blair, with a laugh, confessed that he had long ago given up any such ambition himself. On the bridge they stopped, and Blair looked back at the town lying close to the water. In the evening dusk lights were pricking out all along the shore. The wastelands beyond the furnaces were vague with night mists, faintly amethyst in the east, bronze and black over the city. Here and there in the brown distances flames would suddenly burst out from unseen stacks, then sink, and the shadows close again. I wish I could paint it, Blair said dreamily. Mercer from the bridge, at twilight, is really beautiful. I like the bridge, Elizabeth said, for sentimental reasons. Now, she added to herself, now, I am a bad woman. To speak of that to another man is vile. David and I, she said, significantly, and laughed. Even Blair was startled at the crudeness of the allusion. I didn't suppose David ever condescended to be spoony, he said, and at the same instant, to his absolute amazement, she caught his arm and pulled his hand from the railing. Don't touch that place, she cried. Blair, amused and cynical, laughed under his breath. I see. This is the hallowed spot where you made our friend a happy man? We'll turn back now, please, Elizabeth said, suddenly trembling. She had reached the climax of her anger, and the reaction was like the shock of dropping from a dizzy height. During the walk home she scarcely spoke. When he left her at her uncle's door, she was almost rude. Good night. No, I'm busy. I'd rather you didn't come in. In her own room, without waiting to take off her things, she ran to her desk. She did not even pause to sit down, but bent over, and wrote, sobbing under her breath. David, I am just as false as I can be. I ridiculed you to Blair. I lied and lied and lied, because I was angry. I hated you for a little while. I am low, and vulgar, and a blasphemer. I told him about the bridge. You see how vile I am? But don't give me up, David. Only, understand just how base I am, and then, if you possibly can, keep on loving me. P.S. I am not worth loving. When David read that poor little letter, his face quivered for an instant, then he smiled. Materna, he said, they were sitting at supper. Materna, she certainly is perfect. His mother laughed, and put out her hand. But he shook his head. Not even you, he said. When he went to see Elizabeth that evening, he found her curiously broken. David, how could I do it? I made fun of you. Do you understand? Yes, I truly did. Oh, how vile I am. And I knew I was wild all the time, that's the queer part of it. But I piled it on. And all the time it seemed as if I was just bleeding to death inside. But I kept on doing it. I loved being false. I loved to blacken myself. She drew away from him, shivering. No, don't touch me, don't kiss me, I am not worthy. Oh, David, throw me over. Don't marry me, I am not fit. And as he caught her in his arms, she said, her voice smothered against his breast, you see, you didn't come in at Nanny's. And it looked as if you didn't care. It was humiliating, David. And last night you didn't bring me the book, or even send any message, and that was sort of careless. Yes, I really think you were a little horrid, David. So I was hurt, I suppose, to start with. And you know, when I am hurt, oh, yes, it was silly, but... He kissed her again, and laughed. It was silly, dear. Well, but listen, I am not excusing myself for this afternoon, but I do want you to understand how it started. I was provoked at your not explaining to me why you go away a whole month earlier than you need. I think any girl would be a little provoked, David. And then, on top of it, you let Blair and Nanny see that you didn't care to walk home with me, and... But good gracious, said David, amused and tender, I thought you didn't want me. And it would have been rather absurd to hang round, if I wasn't wanted. Oh, she cried, sharply, lifting her wet face from his breast, don't you see? I want you to be absurd. Can't you understand how a girl feels? She stopped, and sighed. After all, why should you show Nanny and Blair that you care? Why should you wait? I am not worth caring for, or waiting for, anywhere, anytime. Oh, David, my temper, my dreadful temper. He lifted her trembling hand and kissed the scar on her left wrist silently. I ought not to see you tonight, just to punish myself, she said brokenly. You don't know how crazy I was when I was talking to Blair. I was crazy. Oh, why, when I was a child, didn't they make me control my temper? I suppose I'm like my mother, she ended in a whisper. And I can't change, now, I'm too old. David smiled. You are terribly old, he said. Like everybody else, save Mrs. Ritchie, David accepted Elizabeth's temper as a matter of course. She doesn't mean anything by it, her little world had always said, and put up with the inconvenience of her furies, with the patience of people who were themselves incapable of the irrationalities of temper. Oh, you are a hardened sinner, David mocked. You do forgive me? She whispered. At that he was grave. There is nothing I wouldn't forgive, Elizabeth. But I have stabbed you? Yes, a little, but I am yours to stab. Her eyes filled. Oh, it is so wonderful, that you go on loving me. David. You go on loving me, he rallied her, in spite of my dullness and slowness, and all that. But Elizabeth was not listening. Sometimes it frightens me to get so angry, she said, with a somber look. It was just the same when I was a little girl. Do you remember the time I cut off my hair? I think you had hurt my feelings. I forget now what you had done. I was always having my feelings hurt. Of course I was awfully silly. It was a relief then to spoil my body by cutting off my hair. This afternoon it was a relief to put mud on my soul. He looked at her, trying to find words tender enough to heal the wounds she had torn in her own heart. Not finding them, he was silent. Oh, we must face it, she said. You must face it. I am not a good girl. I am not the kind of girl you ought to marry. I'm perfectly sure your mother thinks so. She thinks a person with a temper can't love people. I'll not go away in March. David interrupted her passionately. Of course it might be pleasanter for Materna to get away from old Ferguson, but what is a man's mother, compared with his girl? Elizabeth's pain was intolerable to him. I won't leave you a day before I have to. For a moment her wet eyes smiled. Indeed you shall. I may be wicked, oh, I am. But I am not really an idiot. Only, David, don't take things so for granted, dear, and don't be so awfully sensible, David. Chapter 14. When the door closed behind Blair and Elizabeth, Nanny set out to do that best, which her brother had demanded of her. She went at once into the dining room, but before she could speak, her stepmother called out to her. Here, Nanny. You are just the person I want. Watson's late again, and I'm in a hurry. Just take these letters and sign them. S. Maitland per. NM. They must be posted before 5. Sit down there at the table. Nanny could not sign letters and talk at the same time. She got pen and ink and began to write her stepmother's name, over and over, slowly, like a little careful machine. S. Maitland, S. Maitland. In her desire to please, she discarded her own neat script, and reproduced with surprising exactness the rough signature which she knew so well. But all the while her anxious thoughts were with her brother. She wished he had not rushed off with Elizabeth. If he had only come himself into the detested dining room, his mother would have bidden him sign the letters. He might have read them and talked them over with her, and that would have pleased her. Nanny herself had no ambition to read them. Her eye caught occasional phrases, shares for, new converter, etc., etc. The words meant nothing to Nanny, bending her blonde head and writing like a machine. S. Maitland, S. Maitland. Mama, she began, dipping her pen into the ink, Blair has bought a rather expensive. Mrs. Maitland came over to the table and picked up the letters. That's all. Now clear out, clear out. I've got a lot to do. Then her eye fell on one of the signatures, and she gave her grunt of a laugh. If you hadn't put per NM, I shouldn't have known that I hadn't signed M myself, Nanny. Yes, Mama? Is Blair going to be at home to supper? I think not. But he said he would be in this evening. And he wanted me to ask. Well, perhaps I'll come over to your parlor to see him, if I get through with my work. I believe he goes east again tomorrow? Yes, Nanny said. Mrs. Maitland, at her desk, had begun to write. Nanny wavered for a minute, then, with a despairing look at the back of her stepmother's head, slipped away to her own part of the house. I'll tell her at supper, she promised herself. But in her own room, as she dressed for tea, panic fell upon her. She began to walk nervously about. Once she stopped, and leaning her forehead against the window, looked absently into the dusk. At the end of the cinder path, the vast pile of the foundry rose black against the fading sky. On the left, the open arches of the cast house of the furnace glowed with molten iron that was running into pigs on the wide stretch of sand. The spur track was banked with desolate wastes of slag and rubbish. Beyond them, like an unfolding arm, was the river, dark in the darkening twilight. From under half-shut dampers, flat sheets of sapphire and orange flame roared out in rhythmical pulsations, and above them was the pillar of smoke shot through with flying billions of sparks. Back of this monstrous and ordered confusion was the solemn circling line of hills. It was all hideous and fierce, yet in the clear winter dusk it had a beauty of its own that held Nanny Maitland, even though she was too accustomed to it to be conscious of its details. As she stared out at it with troubled eyes, there was a knock at her door. Before she could say, "Come in," her stepmother entered. "Here," Mrs. Maitland said, "just fix this waist, will you? I can't seem to make it look right." There was a dull flush on her cheek, and she spoke in cross confusion. "Haven't you got a piece of lace, or something? I don't care what. This black dress seems," she broke off and glanced into the mirror. She was embarrassed, but doggedly determined. "Make me look, somehow," she said. Nanny, assenting, and rummaging in her bureau drawer, had a flash of understanding. "She's dressing up for Blair?" She took out a piece of lace, and laid it about the gaunt shoulders, then tucked the front of the dress in, and brought the lace down on each side. The soft old thread seemed as inappropriate as it would have been if laid on a scarcely cooled steel gloom. "Well, pin it, can't you?" Mrs. Maitland said sharply. "Haven't you got some kind of a brooch?" Nanny silently produced a little amethyst pin. "It doesn't just suit the dress, I'm afraid," she ventured. But Mrs. Maitland looked in the glass complacently. "Nonsense," she said, and tramped out of the room. In the hall she threw back, obliged. "Oh, poor Mama," Nanny said. Her sympathy was hardly more than a sense of relief. If her mother was dressing up for Blair, she must be more than usually good-natured. "I'll tell her at supper," Nanny decided, with a lift of courage. But at supper, in the disorderly dining room, with the farther end of the table piled with ledgers, Mrs. Maitland was more unapproachable than ever. When Nanny asked a timid question about the evening, she either did not hear, or she affected not to. At any rate, she vouchsafed no answer. Her face was still red, and she seemed to hide behind her evening paper. To Nanny's gentle dullness this was no betrayal. It merely meant that Mrs. Maitland was cross again, and her heart sank within her. But somehow she gathered up her courage. "You won't forget to come into the parlor, Mama? Blair wants to talk to you about something that. I've got some writing to do." If I get through, I'll come. Now clear out, I'm too busy to chatter. Nanny cleared out. She had no choice. She went over to her vast, melancholy parlor, into which it seemed as if the fog had penetrated, to await Blair. In her restless apprehension, she sat down at the piano, but after the first bar or two her hands dropped idly on the keys. Then she got up and looked aimlessly about. I'd better finish that landscape, she said, and went over to her drawing board. She stood there for a minute, fingering a lead pencil. Her nerves were tense, and yet, as she reminded herself, it was foolish to be frightened. His mother loved Blair. She would do anything in the world for him. Nanny thought of the lace. Yes, anything. Blair was only a little extravagant. And what did his extravagance matter? His mother was so very rich. But oh, why did they always clash so? Then she heard the sound of Blair's key in the lock. Well, Nancy, he said gaily, she's a charmer. Who? Said Nanny, bewildered. Oh, you mean Elizabeth? Yes, but there's a lot of gunpowder lying round loose, isn't there? She was out with David, I suppose because he didn't show up. In fact, she was so mad she was perfectly stunning. Nancy, I think I'll stick it out here for 2 or 3 days. Elizabeth is mighty good fun, and David is in town. We might renew our youth, we four. What do you say? Well, he ended, coming back to his own affairs. What did Mother say? Oh, Blair, I couldn't. What? You haven't told her? Blair dear, I did my best, but she simply never gave me a chance. Indeed, I tried, but I couldn't. She wouldn't let me open my lips in the afternoon, and at supper she read the paper every minute, Harris will tell you. Blair Maitland whistled. Well, I'll tell her myself. It was really to spare her that I wanted you to do it. I always rile her, somehow, poor dear mother. Nanny, this house reeks of cabbage. Does she live on it? Blair threw up his arms with a wordless gesture of disgust. I'm so sorry, Nanny said, but don't tell her you don't like it. The door across the hall opened, and there was a heavy step. The brother and sister looked at each other. Blair, be nice, Nanny entreated. Her soft eyes under the meekly parted blonde hair were very anxious. He did not need the caution. Whenever he was with his mother, the mere instinct of self-preservation made him anxious to be nice. As Mrs. Maitland had her instinct of self-preservation, too, there had been, in the last year, very few quarrels. Instead there was, on his part, an exaggerated politeness, and on her part, a pathetic effort to be agreeable. The result was, of course, entire absence of spontaneity in both of them. Mrs. Maitland, her knitting in her hands, came tramping into the parlor. The piece of thread lace was pushed awry, but there had been further preparation for the occasion. At first her son and daughter did not know what the change was, then suddenly both recognized it, and exchanged an astonished glance. Mother, cried Blair incredulously, earrings? The dull color on the high cheekbones deepened. She smiled sheepishly. Yes, I saw M in my bureau drawer, and put M on. Haven't worn M for years, but Blair, here, likes pretty things. Her son, under his breath, groaned. Pretty, so you are off tomorrow, Blair? She said, politely. She ran her hand along the yellowing bone needles, and the big ball of pink worsted rolled softly down onto the floor. As she glanced at him over her steel-rimmed spectacles, her eyes softened as an eagle's might when looking at her young. I wish his father could see him, she thought. Next time you come home, she said, it will be to go to work. Yes, Blair said, smiling industriously. Pity you have to study this summer. I'd like to have you in the office now. Yes, I'm awfully sorry, he said with charming courtesy, but I feel I ought to brush up on 1 or 2 subjects, and I can do it better abroad than here. I'm going to paint a little, too. I'll be very busy all summer. Why don't you paint our new foundry? Said Mrs. Maitland. She laughed with successful cheerfulness. Blair liked jokes, and this, she thought, complacently, was a joke. Well, I shall manage to keep busy, too, she said. I suppose so, Blair agreed. He was lounging on the arm of Nanny's chair, and felt his sleeve plucked softly. Now, said Nanny. But Blair was not ready. You are always busy, he said. I wish I had your habit of industry. Mrs. Maitland's smile faded. I wish you had. Oh, well, you've got industry enough for this family, Blair declared. But the flattery did not penetrate. Too much, maybe, she said grimly. then remembered, and began to entertain again. I had a compliment today. Blair, with ardent interest, said, "Really? That man Dolliver in our office, you remember Dolliver?" Blair nodded. He happened to say he never knew such an honest man as old Henry B. Knight. "Remember old Mr. Knight?" She paused, her eyes narrowed into a laugh. "He married Molly Wharton. I always called her Goose Molly. She used to make eyes at your father, but she couldn't get him, though she tried too hard enough, by telling him, so I heard, that the only feminine thing about me was my petticoats, a very coarse remark, in my judgment, and as for being feminine, when you were born, I thought of inviting her to come and look at you so she could see what a baby was like. She never had any children. Well, old Knight was elder of the second church. Remember?" "Oh yes," Blair said vaguely. Dolliver said Knight once lost a trade by telling the truth, when he might have kept his mouth shut. That was Dolliver's way of putting it. "Well," I said, "I hope you think that our works are just as honestly conducted as the Knight Mills." Fact was, I knew a thing or two about Henry B. And what do you suppose Dolliver said? "Oh, yes," he said, "you are honest, Mrs. Maitland, but you ain't damn fool honest." She laughed loudly, and her son laughed too, this time in genuine amusement. But Nanny looked prim, at which Mrs. Maitland glanced at Blair, and there was a sympathetic twinkle between them which for the moment put them both really at ease. "I got on to a good thing last week," she said, still trying to amuse him, but now there was reality in her voice. "Do tell me about it," Blair said, politely. "You know Crass? He is the man that's had a bee in his bonnet for the last 10 years about a newfangled idea for making castings of steel. He brought me his plans once, but I told him they were no good. But last month he asked me to make some castings for him to go on his contrivance. Of course I did. We cast anything for anybody, provided they can pay for it. Well, Crass tried it in our foundry. No good, just as I said. The metal was full of flaws. But it occurred to me to experiment with his idea on my own hook. I melted my pig, and poured it into his converter thing. But I added some silvery pig I had on the yard, made when number 1 blew in, and the castings were as sound as a nut. Crass never thought of that." She twitched her pink worsted and gave her grunt of a laugh. "Master Crass hasn't any caveat, and he can't get one on that idea, so of course I can go ahead." "Oh, Mama, how clever you are," Nanny murmured admiringly. "Clever?" said Blair. Nanny shook his arm gently, and he recollected himself. "Well, I suppose business is like love and war. All's fair in business." Mrs. Maitland was silent. Then she said, "Business is war. But fair? It is a perfectly legal thing to do." "Oh, legal, yes," her son agreed significantly. The thin ice of politeness was beginning to crack. It was the old situation over again. He was repelled by unloveliness, this time it was the unloveliness of shrewdness. For a moment his disgust made him quite natural. "It is legal enough, I suppose," he said coldly. Mrs. Maitland did not lift her head, but with her eyes fixed on her needles, she suddenly stopped knitting. Nanny quivered. "Mama," she burst in, "Blair wanted to tell you about something very beautiful that he has found," and her brother pinched her, and her voice trailed into silence. "Found something beautiful? I'd like to hear of his finding something useful." The ice cracked a little more. "As for your mother's honesty, Blair, if you had waited a minute, I'd have told you that as soon as I found the idea was practical I handed it over to Crass. I'm damn fool honest, I suppose." But this time she did not laugh at her joke. Blair was instant with apologies. He had not meant, he had not intended. "Of course you would do the square thing," he declared. "But you thought I wouldn't," she said. And while he was making polite exclamations, she changed the subject for something safer. She still tried to entertain him, but now she spoke wearily. "What do you suppose I read in the paper tonight? Some man in New York, named Maitland, curiously enough, picked up an old master, that's how the paper put it, for $5,000. It appears it was considered cheap. It was 14 by 18 inches. Inches, mind you, not feet. Well, Mr. Distick's friends are not all dead yet. Sorry anybody of our name should do such a thing." Nanny turned white enough to faint. "Allow me to say," said Blair, tensely, "that an old master might be cheap at 5 times that price. I wouldn't give $5,000 for the greatest picture that was ever painted," his mother announced. Then, without an instant's warning, her face puckered into a furious sneeze. "God bless us," she said, and blew her nose loudly. Blair jumped. I would give all I have in the world, he said. Well, his mother said, ramming her grimy handkerchief into her pocket, if it cost all you have in the world, it would certainly be cheap, for, so far as I know, you haven't anything. Alas, the ice had given way entirely. Blair pushed Nanny's hand from his arm, and getting up, walked over to the marble-topped center table. He stood there slowly turning over the pages of the Poetesses of America in rigid determination to hold his tongue. Mrs. Maitland's eyebrow began to rise. Her fingers tightened on her hurrying needles until the nails were white. Nanny, looking from one to the other, trembled with apprehension. Then she made an excuse to take Blair to the other end of the room. Come and look at my drawing, she said, and added under her breath. Don't tell her. Blair shook his head. I've got to, somehow. But when he came back and stood in front of his mother, his hands in his pockets, his shoulder lounging against the mantelpiece, he was apparently his careless self again. Well, he said, gaily, if I haven't anything of my own, it's your fault. You've been too generous to me. The knitting needles flagged. Nanny drew a long breath. Yes, you are too good to me, he said, and you work so hard? Why do you work like a man? There was an uncontrollable quiver of disgust in his voice. His mother smiled, with a quick bridling of her head. He was complimenting her. The soreness from his thrust about legality vanished. Yes, I do work hard. I reckon there's no man in the iron business who can get more poke for his shilling than I can. Blair cast an agonized look at Nanny, then set himself to his task again, in rather a roundabout way. Why don't you spend some of your money on yourself, mother, instead of on me? There's nothing I want. But there are so many things you could have. I have everything I need, said Mrs. Maitland. A roof, a bed, a chair, and food to eat. As for all this truck that people spend their money on, what use is it? That's what I want to know. What's it worth? Blair put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a small beautifully carved jade box. He took off the lid delicately and shook a scarab into the palm of his hand. I'll tell you what that is worth, he said, holding the dull blue oval between his thumb and finger. Then he mentioned a sum that made Nanny exclaim. His mother put down her knitting, and taking the bit of eternity in her fingers, looked at it silently. Do you wonder I got that box, which is a treasure in itself, to hold such a treasure? Blair exulted. Mrs. Maitland, handing the scarab back, began to knit furiously. That's what it's worth, he said. He was holding the scarab in his palm with a sort of tenderness. His eyes caressed it. But it isn't what I paid. The collector was hard up, and I made him knock off 25% of the price. Ha, said Mrs. Maitland. Well, I suppose all's fair in love and collections? What's unfair in that? Blair said, sharply. I buy in the cheapest market. You do that yourself, my dear mother. When Blair said, my dear mother, he was farthest from filial affection. Besides, he said, with strained self-control, besides, I'm like you, I'm not damn fool honest. Oh, I didn't say you weren't honest. Only, if I was going to take advantage of anybody, I'd do it for something more important than a blue china beetle. The trouble with you, mother, is that you don't see anything but those hideous works of yours. Her son burst out. If I did, you couldn't pay for your china beetles. Beetles? You couldn't pay for the breeches you're sitting in. Oh, Mama, oh, Blair, sighed poor Nanny. There was a violent silence. Suddenly Mrs. Maitland brought the flat of her hand furiously down on the table, then, without a word, got on her feet, pulled at the ball of pink worsted which had run behind a chair and caught under the caster. Her jerk broke the thread. The next moment the parlor door banged behind her. Nanny burst out crying. Blair opened and closed his lips, speechless with rage. What made her so angry? Nanny said, catching her breath. Was it the beetle? Don't call it that ridiculous name. I'll have to borrow the $5,000. And where the devil I'll get it I don't know. Nanny, Goose Molly, wasn't an entire fool, after all. Blair, his sister protested, horrified. But Blair was too angry to be ashamed of himself. He could not see that his mother's anger was only the other side of her love. In Sarah Maitland, not only maternity, but pride, the peculiar pride engendered in her by her immense business pride and maternity together, demanded such high things of her son. Not finding them, the pain of disappointment broke into violent expression. Indeed, had this charming fellow, handsome, selfish, sweet-hearted, been some other woman's son, she would have been far more patient with him. Her very love made her abominable to him. She was furiously angry when she left him there in Nanny's parlor. All the same, he did not have to borrow the $5,000. The next morning, Sarah Maitland sent for her superintendent. "Mr. Ferguson," she said. They were in her private office, and the door was shut. "Mr. Ferguson, I think, but I don't know, I think Blair has been making an idiot of himself again. I saw in the paper that somebody called Maitland had been throwing money away on a picture. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. It was 14 by 18 inches, not feet. That was enough for me. Why, Ferguson, those big pictures in my parlor, I bought them when I was going to be married. A woman is sort of foolish then. I wouldn't do such a thing now. Those 4 pictures are 4 by 6 feet each, and they cost me $400, $100 a piece. But this New York man has paid $5,000 for one picture 14 by 18 inches. If it was Blair, and it came over me last night, all of a sudden, that it was, he hasn't got any $5,000 to pay for it. I don't want to go into the matter with him. We don't get along on such subjects. But I want you to ask him about it. Maybe he'll speak out to you, man fashion. If this Maitland is just a fool of our name, so much the better, but if it is Blair, I've got to help him out, I suppose. I want you to settle the thing for me." "I can't." Her voice broke on the last word. She coughed and cleared her throat before she could speak distinctly. "I haven't the time," she said. Robert Ferguson listened, frowning. "You'll give him money to spend in ways you don't approve of?" She nodded sullenly. "I have to." "You don't have to," he broke out. "For God's sake, Mrs. Maitland, stop." "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean, this isn't my business, but I can't see you, Mrs. Maitland. If I get to talking on this subject, we'll quarrel." The glare of anger in her face died out. She leaned back in her chair and looked at him. "I won't quarrel with you. Go on. Say what you think. I won't say I'll take your advice, but I'll listen to it. It's what I have always told you. You are squeezing the life out of Blair by giving him money. You've always done it, because it was the easy thing to do. Let up on him. Give him a chance. Let him earn his money, or go without. Talk about making him independent, you've made him as dependent as a baby. I don't know my Bible as well as you do, but there is a verse somewhere, something about fullness of bread and abundance of idleness. That's what's the trouble with Blair. Fullness of bread and abundance of idleness. But he's been at college. He couldn't work while he was at college," she said, with honest bewilderment. "Of course he couldn't. But why did you let him dawdle round at college, pretending to special, for a year after he graduated? Of course he won't work so long as he doesn't have to. The boy wouldn't be human if he did. You never made him feel he had to get through and to go to work. You've given him everything he wanted, and you've exacted nothing in return, not scholarship, nor even decent behavior. He's gambled, and gone after women, and bought everything on earth he wanted. The only thing he knows how to do is to spend money. He has never done a hand's turn of work in his life. He is just as much a deadbeat as any beggar who gets his living out of other people's pockets. That he gets it out of your pocket doesn't alter that. That he doesn't wear rags and knock at back doors doesn't alter it. He's a deadbeat. Any man is, who takes and doesn't give anything in return. It's queer you can't see that, Mrs. Maitland." She was silent. "Why, look here, I've heard you say, many a time, that the best part of your life was when you had to work hardest. Isn't that so?" She nodded. "Then why in thunder won't you let Blair work? Let him work, or go without?" Again she did not speak. "For heaven's sake, give him a chance, before it's too late." Mrs. Maitland got up, and stood with her back to him, looking out of the smoke-grimed window. Presently she turned round. "Well, what would you do now, supposing he did buy the picture? Tell him that he has overdrawn his allowance, and that if he wants the picture he must earn the money to pay for it. Say you'll advance it, if instead of going to Europe this summer he'll stay at home and go to work. Of course he can't earn $5,000. I doubt if he can earn 5,000 cents. But make up a job, just for this once, and help him out. I don't believe in made-up jobs, on principle, but they're better than nothing. If he won't work, darn the picture. It can be resold. She blew her lips out in a bubbling sigh and began to bite her forefinger. Robert Ferguson had said his say. He gathered his papers together and got on his feet. Mr. Ferguson, he waited, his hand on the knob. Yes? Obliged to you, but for the present. Very well, Robert Ferguson said shortly. Just put through the business of the picture. Hereafter. Ferguson shrugged his shoulders. Chapter 15. After his first spasm of angry disgust, when he declared he would go east the next morning, Blair's fancy for hanging round Mercer hardened into purpose, but he did not hang round his mother's house. The hotel is pretty bad, he told Nanny, but it's better than this, so he took the most expensive suite in the big, dark old river house that in those days was Mercer's best hotel. Its blackened facade and the Doric columns of its entrance gave it a certain exterior dignity, and its interior comfort, combined with the reviving associations of youth, lengthened Blair's 2 or 3 days to a week, then to a fortnight. The day after that distressing interview with his mother, he went gaily round to Mrs. Ritchie's to pound David on the back and say, "Congratulations, old fellow." "Why in thunder," he complained, "didn't I come back before? You've cut me out, you villain." David grinned. Before the devil could come back. The angel had the inside track. He admitted. "Well, if you'll take my advice, you won't be too angelic," Blair said a little dryly. "She always had a touch of the other thing in her, you know." "You think I'd better cultivate a few vices?" David inquired amiably. "I'm obliged for an example, anyhow." But Blair did not keep up the chaffing. The atmosphere of Mrs. Ritchie's house dominated him as completely as when he was a boy. He looked at her serene face, her simple, feminine parlor, the books and flowers and pictures, and thought of his mother and his mother's house. Then, somehow, he was ashamed of his thoughts, because this dear lady said in her gentle way, "How happy your mother must be to have you at home again, Blair. You won't rush right off and leave us, will you?" "Well," he hesitated, "of course I don't want to." He was surprised at the ring of truth in his voice. "But I am going to paint this summer. I am going to be in one of the studios in Paris." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said simply. And Blair had an instant of uncertainty, although a moment before his painting had seemed to him necessary, because it facilitated another summer away from home, and after the interview with his mother's general manager, a summer away from home was more than ever desirable. Mr. Ferguson had handed over the $5,000, and then freed his mind. Blair listened. He heard that he was a sucker, that he was a poor stick, that he wasn't fit to black his mother's boots. "They need it," he said, chuckling, and Robert Ferguson nearly burst with anger. Yet when the check was on its way to New York, and the picture had been shipped to Mercer, Blair still lingered at the river house. The idea of renewing their youth had appealed to all 4 friends. In the next 2 or 3 weeks they were constantly together at either one house or the other, or at some outside rendezvous arranged by Blair, a drive down to Willis's, a theater party and supper, a moonlight walk. Once David suggested ice cream at Mrs. Tidd's. But this fell through. Blair said that even his sentimentality could not face the blue paper roses, and when David urged that the blue paper roses were part of the fun, Blair said, "Well, I'll match you for it." All important decisions ought to be left to chance, to avoid the burden of responsibility. A pitched penny favored Blair, and Mrs. Todd did not see the handsome couples. It was at the end of the first week, when they were all dining with Mrs. Ritchie, the evening meal was beginning to be called dinner nowadays in Mercer, that Mrs. Ritchie's soft eyes, which took duty and energy and ability so sweetly and trustingly for granted, Mrs. Ritchie's believing eyes did for Blair what Robert Ferguson's vociferating truthfulness had not been able to accomplish. It was after dinner, and she and Blair had gone into the little plant room, where the air was sweet with hyacinths and the moist greenness of ferns. "Blair," she said, putting her soft hand on his arm, "I want to say something. You won't mind?" "Mind anything you say? I should think not. It is only that I want you to know that, when the time comes, I shall think it very fine in you, with your tastes and temperament, to buckle down at the works. I shall admire you very much then, Blair." He gave her a droll look. "Alas, dear Mrs. Ritchie," he began, but she interrupted him. "Your mother will be so proud and happy when you get to work, and I wanted you to know that I too." He took her hand from his arm and lifted it to his lips, There was a courtliness about Blair and a certain gravity, which at moments gave him positive distinction. "If there is any good in me," he said, "you would bring it out." Then he smiled. "But probably there isn't any." "Nonsense," she cried, and hesitated. He saw that her leaf brown eyes were wet. "You must make your life worthwhile, Blair. You must. It would be such a dreadful failure if you didn't do anything but enjoy yourself." He was keenly touched. He did not kiss her hand again. He just put his arm around her, as David might have done, and gave her a hug. "Mrs. Ritchie, I will brace up. You are a dear fellow," she said, and kissed him. Then they went back to the other three, to find Elizabeth in a gale of teasing merriment because, she said, David was so terribly talkative. "He has sat there like a bump on a log for 15 minutes, she complained. "Say something, dummy," she commanded. David only chuckled, and pulled Blair into a corner to talk. "You girls keep on your own side. Don't interrupt serious conversation," he said. "Blair, I want to ask you," and in a minute the two young men were deep in their own affairs. It was amusing to see how quickly all four of them fell back into the comfortable commonplace of old friendship, the men roaring over some college reminiscences, and the two girls grumbling at being left out. "Really," said Mrs. Ritchie, "I should think none of you were more than 15. That night, when he took his sister home, Blair was very silent. Her little trickle of talk about David and Elizabeth was apparently unheard. As they turned into their own street, the full moon, just rising out of the river mists, suddenly flooded the wastelands beyond the works. The gaunt outlines of the foundry were touched with ethereal silver, and the Maitland house, looming up in a great black mass, made a gulf of shadow that drowned the dooryard and spread halfway across the squalid street. Beyond the shadow, Shantytown, in the quiet splendor of the moon, seemed as intangible as a dream. "Beautiful," Blair said, involuntarily. He stood for a silent moment, drinking the beauty like wine. Perhaps it was the exhilaration of it that made him say abruptly, "Perhaps I'll not go abroad. Perhaps I'll pitch in." Nanny fairly jumped with astonishment. "Blair, you mean to go into the works? This summer? Oh, how pleased Mama would be. It would be perfectly splendid." "Oh." Nanny gave his arm a speechless squeeze. "If I do, it will be because Mrs. Ritchie bolstered me up. Of course I would hate it like the devil, but perhaps it's the decent thing to do." "Oh, well, don't say anything about it. I haven't made up my mind. This is an awful place," he said, with a shiver, looking across at Shantytown and remembering what was hidden under the glamour of the moon. "The smell of it. Democracy is well enough, Nancy, until you smell it." "But you could live at the hotel," Nanny reminded him, as he pulled out his latchkey. "You bet I would," her brother said, laughing. "My dear, not even your society could reconcile me to the slums. But I don't know whether I can screw myself up to the works, anyhow. David won't be in town, and that would be a nuisance. Well, I'll think it over, but if I do stay, I tell you what it is, you two girls will have to make things mighty agreeable, or I'll clear out." He did think it over, but Blair had never been taught the one regal word of life. He had never learned to say, "I ought." Therefore it needed more talks with Mrs. Ritchie, more days with Elizabeth. David, confound him, wouldn't come, because he had to pack, but Nanny tagged on behind. It needed the bolstering up of much approval on the part of the onlookers, and much self-approval, too, before the screwing up process reached a point where he went into his mother's office in the works and told her that if she was ready to take him on, he was ready to go to work. Mrs. Maitland was absolutely dumb with happiness. He wanted to go to work? He asked to be taken on. "What do you say now, friend Ferguson?" she jeered. "You thought he was going to play at his painting for another year, and you wanted me to put his nose to the grindstone, and make him earn the money to pay for that fool picture. Isn't it better to have him come to it of his own accord? I'd pay for 10 pictures, if they made him want to go to work. As for his painting, it will be his father over again. My husband had his fancies about it, too, but he gave it all up when he married me. Marriage always gives a man common sense, marriage and business. That's how it's going to be with Blair," she ended complacently. "Blair has brains. I've always said so." Robert Ferguson did not deny the brains, but he was as astonished as she. "I believe," he challenged Mrs. Ritchie, "you put him up to it? You always could wind that boy round your finger." I did talk to him, she confessed. It was their last interview, for she and David were starting east that night, and Mr. Ferguson had come in to say goodbye. I talked to him a little. Mrs. Maitland's disappointment about him went to my heart. Besides, I am very fond of Blair. There is a great deal of good in him. You are prejudiced. No, I am not. I admit that, as his mother says, he's no fool, but that only makes his dilly-dallying so much the worse. Still, I believe that if she were to lose all her money, and he were to fall very much in love and be refused, he might amount to something. But it would need both things to make a man of him. Robert Ferguson sighed, and Mrs. Ritchie left the subject of the curative effect of unsuccessful love, with nervous haste. I am going to charge Elizabeth and Nanny to do all they can to make it pleasant for him, so that he won't find the works too terrible, she said. At which reflection upon the works, Mr. Ferguson barked so fiercely that she felt quite at ease with him. But his barking did not prevent her from telling the girls that business would be very hard for Blair, and they must cheer him up. Do try to amuse him. You know it is going to be very stupid for him in Mercer. Nanny, of course, needed no urging. As for Elizabeth, she was a little contemptuous. Oh yes, she would do what she could, she said. Of course, I'm awfully fond of Blair, but... The fact was, she was contrasting in her own mind the man who had to be amused to keep him at his work, with David working himself to death. She told Nanny, proudly. And Nanny, quick to feel the slur in her words, said, "Yes, but it is quite different with Blair. Blair doesn't have to do anything, you know." Still, thanks to Mrs. Ritchie, he was at least going to pretend to do something. And so, at a ridiculously high salary, he entered, as he told Elizabeth humorously, upon his career. The only thing he did to make life more tolerable for himself was to live in the hotel instead of in his mother's house. But it was characteristic of him that he left the wonderful old canvas, the 14 by 18-inch picture, hanging on the wall in Nanny's parlor. "You ought to have something fit for a civilized eye to rest upon," he told her, "and I can see it when I come to see you." If his permanent departure for the river house wounded his mother, she made no protest. She only lifted a pleased eyebrow when he dropped into supper, which, she noticed, he was apt to do whenever Elizabeth happened to take tea with Nanny. When he did come, Sarah Maitland used to look about the dining room table, with its thick earthenware dishes. The last of the old Canton service had found its way to the ash barrel. She used to glance at the three young people with warm satisfaction. "Like old times," she would say kindly, "only needs David to make it complete." Mrs. Maitland was 62 that spring, but there was no stoop of the big shoulders, no sign of that settling and shrinking that age brings. She was at the full tide of her vigor, and her happiness in having her son beside her in the passion of her life, which was second only to her passion for him, showed itself in clumsy efforts to flaunt her contentment before her world. Every morning, with varying unpunctuality, Blair came into her office at the works where she had had a desk placed for him. He was present, because she insisted that he should be, at the regular conferences which she held with the heads of departments. She made a pretense of asking his advice, which was as amusing to Mr. Ferguson and the under-superintendents as it was tiresome to Blair. For after his first exhilaration in responding to Mrs. Ritchie's high belief in him, the mere doing of duty began gradually to pall. Her belief helped him through the first 4 or 5 months, then the whole thing became a bore. His work was ludicrously perfunctory, and his listlessness when in the office was apparent to everybody. At the bottom of her heart, Sarah Maitland must have known that it was all a farce. Blair was worth nothing to the business. His only relation to it was the weekly drawing of an unearned salary. Perhaps if Mrs. Ritchie had been in Mercer, to make again and again the appeal of confident expectation, that little feeble sense of duty which had started him upon his career, might have struck a root down through feeling, into the rock bed of character. But as it was, not even the girl's obedience to her order, to amuse Blair, made up for the withdrawal of her own sustaining inspiration. But at least Nanny and Elizabeth kept him fairly contented out of business hours, and so long as he was contented, things were smooth between him and his mother. There was, as Blair expressed it, only one rumpus that whole summer, and it was a very mild one, caused by the fact that he did not go to church. On those hot July Sunday mornings, his mother in black silk, and Nanny in thin lawn, sat in the family pew, fanning themselves, and waiting, Nanny constantly turning to look down the aisle. Sarah Maitland intent for a familiar step and a hand upon the little baize-lined door of the pew. The rumpus came when, on the third Sunday, Blair was called to account. It was after supper, in the hot dusk in Nanny's parlor. Elizabeth was there, and the two girls, in white dresses, were fanning themselves languidly. Blair, at the piano, was playing the Largo, with much feeling. The windows were open. It was too warm for lamps, and the room was lighted only by the occasional roar of flames, breaking fan-like from the tops of the stacks in the yards. Suddenly, in the midst of their idle talk, Mrs. Maitland came in. She paused for a moment before the dark oblong of canvas on the wall beside the door. Of course, in the half-light, the little dim Mother of God, immortal maternity, could scarcely be seen. She said, a dirty piece of canvas, at about $20 a square inch. No one spoke. Let's see. She calculated. Ore is $10 a ton. 20 tons to a car. Say one locomotive hauls 25 cars. Well, there you have it, a trainload of iron ore. To pay for this, she snapped a thumb and finger against the canvas. Blair jumped, then ran his right hand up the keyboard in a furious arpeggio. But he said nothing. Mrs. Maitland, moving away from the picture, blew out her lips in a loud sigh. Well, she said, tastes differ, as the old woman said when she kissed her cow. Still no one spoke, but Elizabeth rose to offer her a chair. No, she said, coming over and resting an elbow on the mantelpiece, I won't sit down. I'm going in a minute. As she stood there, unrest spread about her as rings from a falling stone spread on the surface of a pool. Blair yawned and got up from the piano. Elizabeth fidgeted. Nanny began to talk nervously. Blair, said his mother, her strident voice overriding the girl's chatter, why don't you come to church? His answer was perfectly unevasive and entirely good-natured. Well, for one thing, I don't believe the things the church teaches. What do you believe? She demanded. And he answered carelessly, that really, he hardly knew. It was, of course, the old difference of the generations, but it was more marked because these two generations had never spoken the same language. Therefore quiet, sympathetic disagreement was impossible. It was impossible, too, because the actual fact was that neither her belief nor his disbelief were integral to their lives. Her creed was a barbarous anthropomorphism, which had created an offended and puerile God, a God of foreign missions and arid church-going and eternal damnation. The fear of her God, such as he was, would, no doubt, have protected her against certain physical temptations, to which, as it happened, her temperament never inclined, but he had never safeguarded her from the temptation of cutthroat competition, or even of business shrewdness which her lawyer showed her how to make legal. Blair, on the contrary, had long ago discarded the naive brutalities of Presbyterianism. Church-going bored him, and he was not interested in saving souls in Africa. But, like most of us, like his mother, in fact, he had a God of his own, a God who might have safeguarded him against certain intellectual temptations, cheating at cards or telling the truth, if the truth would compromise a woman. But as he had no desire to cheat at cards, and the women whom he might have compromised did not need to be lied about, his God was of as little practical value to him as his mother's was to her. So they were neither of them speaking of realities when Mrs. Maitland said, "What do you believe? What have you got instead of God?" "Honor," Blair said promptly. "What do you mean by honor?" she said, impatiently. Well, her son reflected, there are things a man simply can't do, that's all. And that's honor, don't you know? Of course, religion is supposed to keep you from doing things, too. But there's this difference, religion, if you pick pockets, I speak metaphorically, threatens you with hell. Honor threatens you with yourself. As he spoke he frowned, as if a disagreeable idea had occurred to him. His mother frowned too. That hell and a man's self might be the same thing had never struck Sarah Maitland. She did not understand what he meant, and feeling herself at a disadvantage, retaliated with the reproof she might have administered to a boy of 15, "You don't know what you are talking about." The man of 25 laughed lazily. "Your religion is very amusing, my dear mother." Her face darkened. She took her elbow from the mantelpiece and seemed uncertain what to do. Blair sprang to open the door, but she made an irritated gesture. "I know how to open doors," she said. She threw a brief good night to Elizabeth, and turned a cheek to Nanny for the kiss that had fallen there, soft as a little feather, in all the nights of all the years they had lived together. Night, Blair, she said shortly, then hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. There was an instant when the command, "Go to church," trembled upon her lips, but it was not spoken. "I advise you," she said roughly, "to get over your conceit, and try to get some religion into you. Your father and your grandfather didn't think they could get along without it, they went to church. But you evidently think you are so much better than they were that you can stay away." The door slammed behind her. Blair whistled. "Poor dear mother," he sighed, and turned round to listen to the two girls. "Can you be ready to start on the 1st? Elizabeth was asking Nanny, evidently trying to cover up the awkwardness of that angry exit. "Start where?" Blair asked. "Why, east, you know. I told you ages ago," Nanny explained. "Elizabeth and I are going to stay with Mrs. Ritchie at the seashore." "You never said a word about it," Blair said disgustedly. His annoyance knew no disguise. "I call it pretty shabby for you two to go off. What's going to happen to me?" "Business, Blair, business," Elizabeth mocked. But Nanny was plainly conscience-stricken. "I'll not go, if you'd rather I didn't, Blair." "Nonsense," her brother said shortly, "of course you must go," but he did not finish his thought. Whatever it was, he went back to the piano and began to drum idly. His face was sharply annoyed. That definition of his God which he had made to his mother, had aroused a nameless uneasiness. It occurred to him that perhaps he was picking a pocket, in finding such emphatic satisfaction in Elizabeth's society. Now, abruptly, at the news of her approaching absence, the uneasiness sharpened into faintly recognizable outlines. He struck a jarring chord on the piano, and told himself not to be a fool. "She's mighty good fun. Of course I shall miss her or any other girl, in this godforsaken hole. That's all it amounts to. Anyhow, she's dead in love with David." Sitting there in the hot dusk, listening to the voices of the girls, Blair felt suddenly irritated with David. Darn him, why does he go off and leave her in this way? "Not but what it is all right so far as I am concerned. Only, then, wordlessly, his God must have accused him, for he winced. "I am not in the least," he said. The denial confessed him to himself, and there was an angry bang of discordant octaves. The two girls called out in dismay. "Oh, do stop," Elizabeth said. Blair got up from the piano stool and came over to them silently. His thoughts were in clamoring confusion. "I am not," he said again to himself. "I like her, but that's all." There was a look of actual panic on his lazily charming face. He glanced at Elizabeth, who, her head on Nanny's shoulder, was humming softly, "Oh, won't it be joyful, joyful, joyful," and clenched his hands. He was very silent as he walked home with her that night. When they reached her door, Elizabeth looked up at the closed shutters of Mrs. Ritchie's house, and sighed. "How dreary a closed house looks," she said. "I almost wish Uncle would rent it, but he won't. I think he is keeping it for Mrs. Ritchie to live in when David and I settle down in Philadelphia." Blair was apparently not interested in Mrs. Ritchie's future. "I wish," he said, "that I'd gone to Europe this summer." "Well, that's polite considering that Nanny and I have spent our time making it agreeable for you." "I stayed in Mercer because I thought I'd like a summer with Nanny," he defended himself. He was just turning away at the foot of the steps, but he stopped and called back, "With Nanny and you." Elizabeth, from the open door, looked after him with frank astonishment. "How long since Nanny and I have been so much appreciated?" "I think I began to appreciate you a good while ago, Elizabeth," he said, significantly, but she did not hear him. "Perhaps it's just as well she's going," he told himself, as he went slowly back to the hotel. "Not that I'm smitten, but I might be. I can see that I might be, if I should let myself go." But he was confident that allegiance to his God would keep him from ever letting himself go. The girls went east that week, and when they did, Blair took no more meals in the office dining room. It was a very happy time that the inland girls spent with Mrs. Ritchie, in her small house on the Jersey shore. It happened that neither of them had ever seen the ocean, and their first glimpse of it was a great experience. Added to that was the experience, new to both of them, of daily companionship with a serene nature. Mrs. Ritchie was always a little remote, a little inclined to keep people at arm's length. There were undercurrents of sadness in her talk, and she was perhaps rather absorbed in her own supreme affair, maternal love. Also, her calm outlook upon heavenly horizons made the affairs of the girls seem sometimes disconcertingly small, and to realize the smallness of one's affairs is in itself an experience to youth. But in spite of the ultimate reserves they felt in her, Mrs. Ritchie was sympathetic and full of soft gaieties, with endless patience for people and events. Elizabeth's old uneasy dislike of her had long since yielded to the fact that she was David's mother, and so must be, and in theory was, loved. But the love was really only a feint or at what she still called perfection, and during the 2 months of living under the same roof with her, Elizabeth felt at times a resentful consciousness that Mrs. Ritchie was afraid of that ungovernable temper, which, the girl used to say, impatiently, never hurts anybody but myself. Like most high-tempered people, Elizabeth, though penitent and more or less mortified by her outbursts of fury, was always a little astonished when anyone took them seriously, and Mrs. Ritchie took them very seriously. Nanny, being far simpler than Elizabeth, was less impressed by Mrs. Ritchie than by her surroundings, the ocean, the whole gamut of marine sights and happenings, Mrs. Ritchie's housekeeping, the delicate food and serving. What would Harris have thought of that table? All these things, as well as David's fortnightly visits, and Elizabeth's ardors and gay coldnesses, were delights to Nanny. Both girls had an absorbingly good time, and when the last day of the last week finally arrived, and Mr. Robert Ferguson appeared to escort them home, they were both of them distinctly doleful. Every perfect thing stops. Elizabeth sighed to David. They had left the porch, and gone down onto the sands flooded with moonlight and silence. The evening was very still and warm, and the full blue pour of the moon made everything softly unreal, except the glittering path of light crossing the breathing, black expanse of water. David had hesitated when she had suggested leaving the others and coming down here by themselves. Then he had looked at Nanny, sitting between Robert Ferguson and his mother, and seemed to reassure himself, but he was careful to choose a place on the beach where he could keep an eye on the porch. He was talking to Elizabeth in his anxious way, about his work, and how soon his income would be large enough for them to marry. "The minus sign expresses it now," he said. "I could kick myself when I think that, at 26, my mother has to pay my washwoman." Their engagement had continued to accentuate the difference in the development of these two. David's manhood was more and more of the mind. Elizabeth's womanhood was most exquisitely of the body. When he spoke of his shame in being supported by his mother, she leaned her cheek on his shoulder, careless of the 3 spectators on the porch, and said softly, "David, I love you so that I would like to scrub floors for you." He laughed. "I wouldn't like to have you scrub floors, thank you." "Why in thunder don't I get ahead faster?" he sighed. Then he told her that the older men in the profession were so darned mean, even the big fellows, way up, that they kept on practicing when they could just as well sit back on their hind legs and do nothing, and give the younger men a chance. "They are nothing but money grabbers," Elizabeth agreed, burning with indignation at all successful physicians. "But David, we can live on very little. Corned beef is very cheap, cherry pie says. So's liver." Up on the porch the conversation was quite as practical as it was down by the moonlit water. "Elizabeth is to have a little bit of money handed over to her on her next birthday," Mr. Ferguson was saying. Then he twitched the black ribbon of his glasses and brought them tumbling from his nose. "It's an inheritance from her father." "Oh, how exciting," said Nanny. "Will it make it possible for them to be married any sooner?" "They can't marry on the interest on it," he said, with his meager laugh. "It's only a nest egg." Mrs. Ritchie sighed. "Well, of course they must be prudent, but I am sorry to have them wait. It will be some time before David's practice is enough for them to marry on. He is so funny in planning their housekeeping expenses," she said, with that mother laugh of mockery and love. "You should hear the economies they propose." And she told him some of them. They make endless calculations as to how little they can possibly live on. You would never suppose they could be so ignorant as to the cost of things. Of course I enlightened them when they deigned to consult me. I do wish David would let me give him enough to get married on," she ended, a little impatiently. "I think he's right not to," Robert Ferguson said. "David is so queer about money," Nanny commented, and rose, saying she wanted to go indoors to the lamplight and her book. "Pity Blair hasn't some of David's queerness," Mr. Ferguson barked, when she had vanished into the house. Mrs. Ritchie looked after her uneasily, missing her protecting presence. But in Mr. Ferguson's matter-of-fact talk he seemed just the same harsh, kind, unsentimental neighbor of the last 17 years. He's forgotten his foolishness, she thought, and resigned herself, comfortably, to Nanny's absence. Does Elizabeth know about the legacy? She asked. No, she hasn't an idea of it. I was bound that the expectation of money shouldn't spoil her. Well, she jeered at him, I do hope you are satisfied now, that she is not spoiled by money or anything else. How afraid you were to let yourself really love the child, poor little Elizabeth. I had reason, he insisted doggedly. Life had played a trick on me once, and I made up my mind not to build on anybody again, until I was sure of them. Then, without looking at her, he said, as if following out some line of thought, I hope you have come to feel that you will marry me, Mrs. Ritchie? Oh, she said, in dismay. I don't see why you can't make up your mind to it, he continued, frowning. I know, he stopped, and put on his glasses carefully with both hands, I know I am a bear, but you are not. Don't interrupt. I am, but not at heart. Listen to me, at my age, talking about hearts. They both laughed, and then Mr. Ferguson gave a snort of impatience. Look at those two youngsters down there, engaged to be married, and swearing by the moon that nobody ever loved as they do. How absurd it is. A man has to be 50 before he knows enough about love to get married. Nonsense. I cannot take youth seriously, he ruminated, its behavior, yes, that may be serious enough. Youth is always firing the Ephesian dome, but youth itself, and its opinions, always seem to me a little ridiculous. Yet those two infants seem to think that they have discovered love. Well, he interrupted himself, in sudden somber memory, I felt that way once myself. And yet now, I know. Mrs. Ritchie said hurriedly something about its being too damp for Elizabeth on the sand. Do call them in. He laughed. No, you don't need em. I won't say any more tonight. Here they come, Mrs. Ritchie said in a relieved voice. A minute before, David, looking up at the porch, and discovering Nanny's absence, had said, let's go in. Oh, must we? Elizabeth said, reluctantly. I'd so much rather sit down here and have you kiss me. But she came, perforce, for David, in his anxiety not to leave his mother alone with Mr. Ferguson, was already halfway up the beach. Do tell Elizabeth about the money now, Mrs. Ritchie said. I will, said Robert Ferguson, but added, under his breath, I shan't give up, you know. Mrs. Ritchie was careful not to hear him. Elizabeth, she said, eagerly, your uncle has some news for you. And Mr. Ferguson told his niece briefly, that on her birthday in December she would come into possession of some money left her by her father. Don't get up your expectations, it's not much, he said, cheerily, but it's something to start on. Oh, uncle, how splendid, she said, and caught David's hand in both of hers. David. Her face was radiantly unconscious of the presence of the others. Perhaps we needn't wait 2 years? I'm afraid it won't make much difference. David spoke rather grimly. I must be able to buy your shoestrings myself, you know, before we can be married. Elizabeth dropped his hand, and the dimple straightened in her cheek. Mrs. Ritchie smiled at her. Young people have to be prudent, dear child. How much money shall I have, uncle? Elizabeth asked coldly. He told her, not a fortune, but David needn't worry about your shoestrings. Yes, I will, he broke in, with a laugh. She'll have to go barefoot, if I can't get em for her. Elizabeth exclaimed, with angry impatience, and Robert Ferguson, chuckling, struck him lightly on the shoulder. Look out you don't fall over backward trying to stand up straight. He said. The possibility of an earlier wedding day was not referred to again. The next morning they all went up to town together in the train, and Elizabeth, who had recovered from her momentary displeasure, did no more than cast glowing looks at David, lovely, melting looks of delicate passion, as virginal as an opening lily, looks that said, I wish we did not have to wait. For her part, she would have been glad to go barefoot, if only they might the sooner tread the path of life together. When they got into Mercer, late in the evening, who should meet them at the station but Blair? Robert Ferguson, with obvious relief, immediately handed his charges over to the young man with a hurried explanation that he must see someone on business before going to his own house. Take the girls home, will you, Blair? Blair said that was what he was there for. His method of taking them home was to put Nanny into one carriage, and get into another with Elizabeth, who, a little surprised, asked where Nanny was. "It would delay you to go round to our house first," Blair explained. "You forget we live in the slums. And Nanny's in a hurry, so I sent her directly home. She doesn't mind going by herself, you know. Look here, your two girls have been away an abominably long time. I've been terribly lonely without Nanny." He had indeed been lonely without Nanny. In these empty, meaningless weeks at the works, Blair Maitland had suddenly stumbled against the negations of life. Hitherto, he had known only the easy and delightful ascents of fate. This was his first experience with the inexorable no. A week after the girls went east, he admitted to himself that, had David been out of the way, he would undoubtedly have fallen in love with Elizabeth. "As it is, of course I haven't," he declared. Night after night in those next weeks, as he idled moodily about Mercer's streets, or, lounging across the bridge, leaned on the handrail and watched the ashes from his cigar flicker down into the unseen current below, he said the same thing: "I am not in love with her, and I shan't allow myself to be. I won't let it go any farther. But David is no man for a girl like Elizabeth to marry." Then he would fall to thinking just what kind of man Elizabeth ought to marry. Such reflections proved, so he assured himself, how entirely he knew that she belonged to David. Sometimes he wondered sullenly whether he had not better leave Mercer before she came back. Perhaps it was his God who made this suggestion. If so, he did not recognize a divine voice. He always decided against such a course. It would be cowardly, he told himself, to keep away from Elizabeth. "I will see her when she gets home, just as usual. To stay away might make her think that I was afraid. And I am not in the least, because I am not in love with her, and I shall not allow myself to be." He was perfectly sure of himself, and perfectly sincere, too. What lover has ever understood that love has nothing to do with volition? Now, alone with her in the old depot carriage, his sureness permitted him to say, significantly, "I have been terribly lonely without Nanny." "I thought you were absorbed in business cares," she told him drolly. "How do you like business, Blair, really?" "Loathe it," he said succinctly. "Elizabeth, come and take dinner with us tomorrow evening?" "Oh, Nanny's had enough of me. She's been with me for nearly 2 months." "I haven't been with you for 2 months. Be a good girl, and do some missionary work. Slumming is the fashion, you know. Come and cheer me up. It's been fiendishly stupid without you." She laughed at his sincerely gloomy voice. "Come," he urged. We'll have dinner in the back parlor. Do you remember that awful dinner party?" He laughed as he spoke, but being sure in the darkness of the shabby hack he looked at her intently. "Oh, if David were only out of the way." Remember it? I should think I did." There was no telltale flicker on her smooth cheek. Even in the gloom of the carriage he could see that the dark amber of her eyes brimmed over with amusement, and the dimple deepened entrancingly. How could I forget it? Didn't I wear my first long dress to that dinner party? Oh, and my 6-button gloves? I said Blair, and paused. I remember other things than the gloves and long dress, Elizabeth. Why shouldn't he say as much as that? He was certain of himself, and David was certain of her, so why not speak of what it gave him a rapturous pang to remember? But at his words the color whipped into her cheek, her clear brows drew together into a slight frown. How is your mother, Blair? She said coldly. "Oh, very well. Can you imagine mother anything but well? The heat has nearly killed me, but mother is iron. She's perfectly wonderful." "Yes, wonderful woman," he agreed carelessly. "Elizabeth, promise you'll come tomorrow evening?" Cherry Pie would think it was horrid in me not to stay with her, when I've been away so long. "I think it's horrid in you not to stay with me." She laughed, then sighed. "David is working awfully hard, Blair." "Darn David," he retorted, laughing. "So am I, if that's any reason for your giving a man your society. You couldn't work hard to save your life." "I could, if I had somebody to work for, as David has." "You'd better get somebody," she said gaily. "I don't want any second bests," he declared. "Donkey," Elizabeth said good-naturedly. But she was a little surprised, for whatever else Blair was, he was not stupid, and such talk is always stupid. That it had its root in anything deeper than chaffing never occurred to her. They were at her own door by this time, and Blair, helping her out of the carriage, looked into her face and his veins ran hot. The next morning, when he went to see Nanny, he was absorbed and irritable. Girls are queer, he told her, they marry all kinds of men. But I'll tell you one thing, David is the last man for a girl like Elizabeth. He is perfectly incapable of understanding her. That was the first day that he did not assure himself that he was not in love. Chapter 16. That autumn, with its heats and brown fogs and sharp frosts, was the happiest time in Sarah Maitland's life, the happiest time, at least, since those brief months of marriage. Blair was in the business. If only his father could see him, she used to say to herself. Of course, she had moments of disappointment, once or twice moments of anger, even, and once, at any rate, she had a moment of fright. She had summoned her son peremptorily to go with her to watch a certain experiment. Blair appeared, shrinking, bored, absent-minded, nearly an hour later than the time she had set. That put her in a bad humor to start with, but as they were crossing the yards, her irritation suddenly deepened into dismay. Blair, his lip drooping with disgust at the sights and sounds about him, his hands in his pockets, was lounging along behind her, and she, realizing that he was not at her side, stopped and looked back. He was standing still, looking up, his eyes radiant, his lips parted with delight. "What is it?" she called. He did not hear her. He stood there, gazing at 3 white butterflies that were zigzagging into a patch of pale blue sky. How they had come into this black and clamorous spot, why they had left their fields of goldenrod and asters farther down the river, who can say? But here they were, darting up and up, crossing, dipping, dancing in the smoky sunshine that flooded thinly the noisy squalor of the yards. Blair, looking at them, said, under his breath, in pure delight, "Yes, just like the high notes." A flight of violin notes. "Blair," came the impatient voice, "what's the matter with you?" "Nothing, nothing. I was just going to tell you that a high silicon pig." "My dear mother," he interrupted wearily, "there is something else in the world than pig. I saw 3 butterflies." Butterflies. She stood in the cinder pathway in absolute consternation. Was her son a fool? For a moment she was so startled that she was not even angry. "Come on," she said soberly, and they went into the works in silence. That evening, when he dropped into supper, she watched him closely, and by her face lightened a little. Of course, to stop and gape up into the air was silly, but certainly he was talking intelligently enough now, though it was only to Elizabeth Ferguson, who happened to be taking supper with them. Yes, he did not look like a fool. He has brains, she said to herself, frowning, but why doesn't he use them? She sighed, and called out loudly, "Harris? Corned beef." But as she hacked off a slab of boiled meat, she wondered why on earth Nanny asked Elizabeth to tea so often, and especially why she asked her on those evenings when Blair happened to be at home. Elizabeth is such a little blatherskite, she reflected, good-naturedly, the boy doesn't get a chance to talk to me. Then it occurred to her that perhaps he came because Elizabeth came? For it was evident that she amused him. Well, Sarah Maitland had no objection. To secure her son for her dingy supper table she was willing to put up with Elizabeth or any other girl. But certainly Nanny invited her very often. "I'll come in tonight, if you'll invite Elizabeth," Blair would bribe her. And Nanny, like Mrs. Maitland herself, would have invited anybody to gain an hour of her brother's company. Those 4 weeks had committed Blair Maitland to his first real passion. He was violently in love, and now he acknowledged it. The moment had come when his denials became absurd, even to himself, so he no longer said he did not love her. He merely said he would never let her know he loved her. "If she doesn't know it, I am square with David," he argued. Curiously enough, when he said David, he always thought of David's mother. He was profoundly unhappy, and yet exhilarated. There is always exhilaration in the aching melancholy of hopeless love. But somewhere, back in his mind, there was probably the habit of hope. He had always had everything he wanted, so why should not fate be kind now? Of course, without any questionable step on his part. "I will never tell her," he assured himself. The words stabbed him, but he meant them. He only wished, irrationally enough, that Mrs. Ritchie might know how agonizingly honorable he was. Elizabeth herself did not know it. She had not the slightest idea that he was in love with her. There were probably two reasons for an unconsciousness which was certainly rather unusual, for a woman almost always knows. Some tentacles of the soul seem brushed by the brutalities of the material fact, and she knows and retreats or advances. Elizabeth did not know, and so did not retreat. Perhaps one reason for her naive stupidity was the commonplaceness of her relations with Blair. She had known him all her life, and except for that one childish playing at love, which, if she ever remembered it, seemed to her entirely funny, she had never thought of him in any other way than as Nanny's brother. And Nanny was, for all practical purposes, her sister. Another reason was her entire absorption in her own love affair. Ever since she had learned of the little legacy, the ardent thought had lurked in her mind that it might, somehow, in spite of David's absurd theories about shoestrings, hasten her marriage. With all this money, why on earth should we wait? She fretted to Nanny. My dear, you couldn't live on the interest of it. I don't know why not, Elizabeth said, wilfully. Goose. Nanny said, much amused. No, the only thing you could do would be to live on your principal. Why don't you do that? Elizabeth looked suddenly thoughtful. When she went home, she repeated Nanny's careless words to Miss White, who nibbled doubtfully, and said she never heard of such a thing. But after that, for days, they talked of household economies, and with cherry pie's help Elizabeth managed to pare down those estimates which had so diverted her uncle and Mrs. Ritchie. With such practical preoccupations, no wonder she was unconscious of the change in Blair. Suddenly, like a stone flung through the darkness at a comfortably lighted domestic window, she saw, with a crash of fright, a new and unknown Blair, a man who was a complete and dreadful stranger. It was dusk. She had come in to see Nanny and talk over that illuminating suggestion. Why not live on the principal? But Nanny was not at home, so Elizabeth sat down in the firelight in the parlor to wait for her. She sat there, smiling to herself, eager to tell Nanny that she had argued Cherry Pie into admitting that the plan of living on the principal was at least feasible, and also that she had sounded her uncle, and believed that if she and David and Cherry Pie attacked him, all together, they could make him consent. But of course David will simply have to insist, she thought, a little apprehensively, for Uncle Robert is so awfully sensible. Then she began to plan just how she must tell David of this brilliant idea, and make him understand that they need not wait. As soon as he really understands it, he won't listen to any prudence from Uncle. She said, her eyes crinkling into a laugh. But how should she make him understand? She must admit at once, because he was so silly and practical, that, of course, the interest on her money would not support them. Then she must show him her figures. David was always crazy about figures. Well, she had them, she had brought them with her to show Nanny. They proved conclusively that she and David could live on her capital for at least 2 years. It would certainly last as long as that, perhaps even for 2 years and a half. When they had exhausted it, why, then, David's income from his profession would be large enough even if, she blushed nobly, sitting there alone looking into the fire, even if. Thinking this all out, absorbed and joyous, a little jealous because this practical idea had come to Nanny and not to her, she did not hear Blair enter. He stood beside her a moment in silence before she was aware of his presence. Then she looked up with a start and, leaning back in her chair, the firelight in her face, smiled at him. Where's Nanny? I don't know. Church, I think. But I am glad of it. I would rather see you alone. His voice trembled. He had come in all the unrest of misery. He had said to himself that he was going to tell Nanny, anyhow. The impulse to tell had become almost a physical necessity, and when he came into the room, the whole unhappy, hopeless business was hot on his lips. The mere unexpectedness of finding her here, alone, was like a touch against that precariously balanced sense of honor, which was his God, and had so far kept him, as he expressed it to himself, square with David. To Elizabeth, sitting there in friendly idleness by the fire, the thrill in his voice was like some palpable touch against her breast. Without knowing why, she put her hand up, as if warding something off. She was bewildered, her heart began to beat violently. Instantly, at the sight of the lovely, startled face, the rain broke. He forgot David, he forgot his God, with whom he had been juggling words for the last 2 months, he forgot everything, except the single, eternal, primitive purpose. There was the woman he wanted. And all his life, if he had wanted anything, he had had it. With a stifled cry, he caught her hand. "Elizabeth, I love you." "Stop," she said, outraged and astounded. "Stop this instant. I must speak to you." "You shall not speak to me." She was on her feet, trying with trembling fingers to put on her hat. "Elizabeth, wait," he panted. "Wait, listen, I must speak," and before she knew it, he had caught her in his arms, and she felt his breath on her mouth. She pushed him from her, gasping almost, and looking at him in anger and horror. "How dare you? Listen. Only 1 minute." "I will not listen 1 second. Let me out of this room, out of this house." "Elizabeth, forgive me. I am mad." "You are mad. I will never forgive you. Stand aside. Open the door." "Elizabeth, I love you. I love you. Won't you listen?" But she had gone, flaming with anger and humiliation. When Nanny came in an hour later, her brother was sitting with his head bowed in his hands. The room was quite dark, the fire had died down. The fire of passion had died down, too, leaving only shame and misery and despair. His eyes, hidden in his bent arms, were wet. He was shaken to the depths of his being. For the first time in his life he had come against a thwarted desire. The education that should have been spread over his whole 25 years, an education that would have taught him how to meet the negations of life, of duty, of pity even, burst upon him now in one shattering moment. He had broken his law, his own law, and, mercifully, his law was breaking him. When he rose to his feet as his sister came into the room, he staggered under the shock of such concentrated education. "Blair, what is it?" she said, catching his arm. "Nothing. Nothing. I've been a fool. Let me go." "But tell me. I'm frightened. Blair." "It's nothing, I tell you." "Nanny, will she ever look at me again?" "Oh no. No, she will never forgive me. Why was I such a fool?" "What are you talking about?" Poor Nanny said. It came into her head that he had suddenly gone out of his senses. Blair sank down again in a heap on his chair. "I've been a damned fool. I'm in love with Elizabeth, and I told her so." Chapter 17. Of course, with that scene in the parlor, all the intimacies of youth were broken short of, although between the two girls some sort of relationship was patched up. Nanny, thrown suddenly into the whirlpool of her brother's emotions, was almost beside herself with distress. She was nearly 28 years old, but this was her first contact with the primitive realities of life. With that contact, which made her turn away her horrified, virginal eyes, was the misery of knowing that Blair was suffering. She was ready to annihilate David, had such a thing been possible, to give her brother what he wanted. As David could not be made non-existent, she did her best to comfort Blair by trying to make Elizabeth forgive him. The very next day she came to plead that Blair might come himself to ask for pardon. Elizabeth would not listen. "Please don't speak of it." "But Elizabeth, I am perfectly furious, and I am very disgusted. I never want to see Blair again." At which Blair's sister lifted her head. "Of course, he ought not to have spoken to you, but I think you forget that he loved you long before David did." "Nonsense," Elizabeth cried out impatiently. But Nanny's tears touched her. "Nanny, I can't see him, and I won't, but I'll come and see you when he is not there." At which Nanny flared again. "If you are angry at my brother, and can't forgive just a momentary, a passing feeling, which, after all, Elizabeth, is a compliment, at least everybody says it's a compliment to have a man say he loves you. Not if you're engaged to another man." Elizabeth burst in, scarlet to her temples. "Blair loved you before David thought of you. Now, Nanny, don't be silly. If you can't overlook it, because of our old friendship, you will have to drop me, too, Elizabeth." Nanny was so pitiful and trembling that Elizabeth put her arms around her. "I'll never drop you, dear old Nanny." So, as far as the two girls were concerned, the habit of affection persisted, but Mrs. Maitland was not annoyed by having Elizabeth present when Blair came to supper. Blair did not come to supper very often now. He did not come to the works. "Is your brother sick?" Sarah Maitland asked her stepdaughter. 3 or 4 days later. "He hasn't been at his desk since Monday." "What's the matter with him?" "He is worried about something, Mama." "Worried? What on earth has he got to worry him?" She grunted. In her own worry she had come across the hall to speak to Nanny, and find out, if she could, something about Blair. As she turned to go back to the dining room, a little more uneasy than when she came in, her eye fell on that picture which Blair had left, a small oasis in the desert of Nanny's parlor, and with her hand on the doorknob she paused to look at it. The sun was lying on the dark oblong, and in those illuminated depths maternity was glowing like a jewel. Sarah Maitland saw no art, but she saw divine things. She bent forward and looked deep into the picture. Suddenly her eyes smiled until her whole face softened. "Why, look at his little foot," she said, under her breath. "She's holding it in her hand." She was silent for a moment, then she spoke as if to herself. "When Blair was as big as that, I bought him a pair of green Morocco slippers. I don't suppose you remember them, Nanny? They buttoned round the ankle. They had white china buttons. He used to try to pick the buttons off." She smiled again vaguely, then blinked as if awakening from a dream, and blew a long bubbling sigh through her closed lips. "I can't imagine why he doesn't come to the office." In the dining room, as she took up her pen, she frowned. "Debt again?" she asked herself. But when, absorbed and irritable, Blair came into her office at the works, and sat down at his desk to write endless letters that he tore up as soon as they were written, she did not ask for any explanation. She merely told Robert Ferguson to tell the bookkeeper to make a change in the payroll. "I'm going to raise Blair's salary," she said. Money was the only panacea Mrs. Maitland knew anything about. That next fortnight left its marks on Blair Maitland. People who have always had what they want, have a sort of irrational certainty of continuing to have what they want. It makes them a little inhumanly young. Blair's face, which had been as irresponsible as a young fawn's, suddenly showed those scars of thwarted desire which mean age. There was actual agony in his sweet, shallow eyes, and with it the half-resentful astonishment of one who, being unaccustomed to suffering, does not know how to bear it. He grew very silent, he was very pale. In his pain he turned to his sister with an openness of emotion which frightened and shamed her. He had no self-control and no dignity. "I must see her. I must. Go and ask her to see me for a moment. I've disgusted her," Nanny blushed, "but I'll make her forgive me." Sometimes he burst out in rages at David. What does he know about love? What kind of a man is he for Elizabeth? She's a girl now, but if he gets her, God help him when she wakes up, a woman. Not that I mean to try to get her. Understand that. Nothing is farther from my mind than that.
She belongs to him, I play fair.
I don't pretend to be a saint, but I play fair. I don't cut in, when the man's my friend. No, I just want to see her and ask her to forgive me. That's all. Nanny, for God's sake ask her if she won't see me, just for 5 minutes. He quivered with despair. Twice he went himself to Mr. Ferguson's house. The first time Miss White welcomed him warmly, and scuttled upstairs saying she would tell Elizabeth. She came down again, very soberly. "Elizabeth is busy, Blair, and she says she can't see you." The next time he called he was told at the door that Miss Elizabeth asks to be excused. Then he wrote to her, "All I ask is that you shall see me, so that I can implore you to pardon me." Elizabeth tore the letter up and threw it into the fire. But she softened a little. "Poor Blair," she said to herself, "but of course I shall never forgive him." She had not told David what Blair had done. He would be furious, she thought. "I'll tell him later, when we are married." At the word, the warm, beautiful wave of young love rose in her heart. "Later, when I belong to him, I will tell him everything." She would tell him everything just as she would give him everything. Not that she had much to give him, only herself and her little money. That blessed money, on which he and she could live for 2 years, she was going to give him that. For she and Nanny and Cherry Pie had decided that if the money were his, by a gift, then David, who was perfectly crazy and noble about independence, would feel that he and Elizabeth were living on his money, not hers. It was an artless and very feminine distinction, but serious enough to the 3 women who were also young, Elizabeth, in fact, being the oldest, and Cherry Pie, at 63, the youngest. And not only had they discovered this way of overcoming David's scruples about a shorter engagement, but Elizabeth had had another inspiration. Why not be married on the very day that the money came into her possession? "Oh, splendid," said Nanny, but she spoke with an effort, remembering Blair. A little timidly, Elizabeth had told her uncle of this wonderful plan about the money. He snorted with amusement at her way of whipping the devil round the stump by a gift to David, but after a rather startled moment, although he would not commit himself to a date, he was inclined to think an earlier marriage practicable.
We are selfish creatures at best, all of us. Elizabeth's way of being happy herself opened the possibility of happiness for her uncle.
Mrs. Ritchie can't make David an excuse for saying no. If the boy gets a home of his own, he thought, and added to himself, of course, when the child's money is used up, I'll help them out. But to his niece he only barked warningly. Well, let's hear what David has to say. He has some sense. Do you think there's much doubt as to what he'll say? Elizabeth said, and the dimple deepened so entrancingly that Robert Ferguson gave her a meager kiss. After securing this somewhat tentative consent, Elizabeth and Cherry Pie decided that the next thing to do was to make David write to Uncle, and simply insist that the wedding shall be next month. Her plan was very simple. When David came to Mercer to spend her birthday, he should receive, at the same moment, her money and herself. That future time of sacramental giving and of complete taking was in her thoughts with tenderness and shame and glory, as it is in the thought of every woman who loves and forgets herself. Yes, he could have her now, but he must take her money. That was the price he had to pay, the taking of her money. That it would be a high price to a man with his peculiarly intense feeling about independence, Elizabeth knew, but he would be willing to pay it. Elizabeth could not doubt that. No price could be too high, he loved her so. She shivered with happiness at the thought of how he loved her. Some soft impulse of passion made her lift her round wrist, that bitten wrist, to her mouth and kiss it, hard. David had kissed it, many times. Yes, she was his if he would pay the price. She was going to tell him so, and then wait, glowing, and shrinking, and eager, for him to come and take her. It was so true, so limpid, this noble flame that burned in her, that she almost forgot Blair's behavior. The only thing she thought of was her plan, and the difficulty of putting it into the cold limits of pen and ink. But with much joyous underlining of important words she did succeed in stating it to him. She told him, not only the practical details, but with a lovely, untrammeled outpouring of her soul which was sacrificial. She told him that she wanted to be his wife.
She had no reserves, it was an elemental moment, and the matter of what is called modesty had no place in her ardent purity.
It really has a place in organic impulses. In connection with death or birth or love, modesty is only a rather puerile self-consciousness. So Elizabeth, who had never been self-conscious in her life, told David, with perfect simplicity, that she wanted to be married. She said she had worked the money part of it out, and according to her latest estimate of how much, or rather how little, they could live on, it was possible. You will say, we haven't even as much as this, she wrote, after she had stated what seemed to be the minimum income. Then, triumphantly, we have. The money Uncle is going to give me on my birthday. If we live on it, instead of hoarding it up, it will last at least 2 years. I've talked to Uncle about it, and I'm pretty sure he will consent, but you'd better write and urge him, just insist. Then she approached the really difficult matter of making David agree to live on money that was not his. She admitted that she knew how he felt on such matters. And you are all wrong, she declared candidly, wrong and a goose. But, so long as you do feel so, why, you needn't any longer. For I am going to give the money to you.
It is to be yours, not mine.
You can't refuse to use the money that is yours, that comes to you as a gift. It will be as much yours as if somebody left it to you in their will, and you can burn it up, if you want to. And when business had been written out, her heart spoke. Dear, she stopped to kiss the paper, dear, I hope you won't burn it up, because I am tired of waiting, and I hope you are too. When she wrote those last words, she was suddenly shy. Uncle is to give me the money on my birthday, let us be married that day. I want to be married. I am all yours, David, all my soul, and all my mind, and all my body. I have nothing that is not yours to take, so the money is yours. No, I will not even give it to you. It belongs to you already as I do. Dear, come and take it, and me. I love you, love you, love you. I want you to take me. I want to be your wife. Do you understand? I want to belong to you. I am yours. So she tried, this untutored creature, to put her soul and body into words, to write the thing that cannot even be spoken, whose utterance is silence. The mailing of the letter was a rite in itself. In the dusk, as she held the green lip of the post box open, she kissed the envelope, as she had kissed the glowing sheet an hour before. She said to herself that she was too happy to live. As she said it, a wave of pity blotted out her usual shamed resentment at that poor mother of hers who had not been happy, and whose lack of self-control was, Elizabeth believed, her legacy to her child. But her gravity was only for a moment. Forgetting Blair and the possible chance of meeting him, she flew down to Nanny's to tell her that the die had been cast, the letter had been written. Nanny, sitting by herself in the parlor, brooding over her brother's troubles, was trying to draw, but Elizabeth brushed aside pencils and crusts of bread and India rubbers, and flung her arms about her, pressing her face against hers and pouring the happy secret into her ear. "Oh, Nanny, I've told him. We'll be married on my birthday. Go ahead and get your dress," she said, breathlessly, and Nanny tried her best to be happy, too. For the next 3 days Elizabeth moved about in a half-dream, sometimes reddening suddenly, sometimes breathing a little quickly, with a faint fright in her eyes. Had she said too much? Would he understand? Then a gush of confident love filled her like music. "I couldn't say too much. I want him to know that I feel that way." When David read that throbbing letter, he grew scarlet to his temples. There had been many moments during their engagement when Elizabeth, in slighter ways, had bared her soul to him, and always he had had the impulse to cover his eyes, as in a holy of holies. He had never, in those moments, dared to take advantage of such divine nakedness, even by a kiss.
But she had never before trusted her passion to the coldness of pen and ink. It had had the accompaniment of eyes and lips, and eager, waking voice.
Perhaps if the letter had come at a different moment, he could more easily have called up that voice, and those humid eyes. He might have felt again the rose pressure of the soft mouth. As it was, he read it in troubled preoccupation, then reddened sharply. He was a worthless cuss. He couldn't stand on his own legs and get married like a man. His girl had to urge her uncle to let her support her lover. "Damn," said David softly. "A letter is a risky thing. The writer gambles on the reader's frame of mind." David's frame of mind when he read those words about urging Robert Ferguson was not hospitable to other people's generosity, for Elizabeth's hot letter came on what had been, figuratively speaking, a very cold day. In the morning he had been reprimanded by the house officer for some slight forgetfulness, a forgetfulness caused by his absorption in planning an experiment in the laboratory. At noon he made the experiment, which, instead of crowning a series of deductions with triumphant proof, utterly failed. Then he had had pressing reminders of bills, still unpaid, for a pair of trousers and a case of instruments, and he had admitted to himself that he would have to ask his mother for the money to meet them.
"I am a fizzle, all round," he had told himself grimly.
Can't remember anything overnight. Can't count on a doggone reaction. Can't pay for my own pants. I won't be able to marry for 10 years. If Elizabeth is wise, she will throw me over. She'll be tired of waiting for me, before I can earn enough to buy my instruments, let alone the shoestrings Mr. Ferguson talked about. Then her letter came. It was a spur on rolled flesh. Elizabeth was tired of waiting. She said so, but she would help him. She had induced her uncle to consent that she should give him money, that she should, in fact, support him, just as his mother had been doing all his life. He was so with disappointment at himself, yet, when he answered her letter his eyes stung at the thought of the loveliness of her love. He held her letter in his hand as he wrote, and once he put it to his lips. All the same he wrote, as he had to write, laconically. "Dear Elizabeth, I'm sure Mr. Ferguson will agree with me that your money cannot be mine, by any gift. Calling it so won't make it so. Anyhow, it would not support us 2 years. By that time, as things look now, I shall probably not be earning any kind of an income. I am sorry you are tired of waiting, but I can't let you be imprudent. And apart from prudence, I could not respect myself if you supported me. It has been misery to me to have Materna saddled with a big, lazy brute of a fellow like me, who ought by this time to be taking care of you both. I am sure, if you think it over, you would be ashamed of me if I asked your uncle to help me out by letting you marry me now. Anyhow, I should be ashamed of myself. Well, the Lord only knows when I will come up to time. You might as well make up your mind to it that I'm a fizzle. I am discouraged with myself and everything else, and I see you are too. Heaven knows I don't blame you. I know you think it is an awfully long time to wait, but it isn't as long to you as it is to me. Dear, I love you. I can't tell you how I love you. I haven't words, as you have, but you know I do, and yet sometimes I feel as if I oughtn't to marry you." Elizabeth, running down the steps to meet the postman, saw a familiar imprint on the corner of an envelope, and drew it from the pack before the good-natured man could hand it to her. "Guess you don't want no Philadelphia letter?" he said slyly. "Of course I don't. she retorted, and the trudging postman smiled for a whole block because of the light in her face. In the house, the letter in her hand, she stopped to hug Miss White. "Cherry pie. The letter has come. I'm to be married on my birthday." "Oh, my lamb," said Cherry Pie, "however shall I get things ready in time?" Elizabeth did not wait to help her in her housekeeping anxieties. She fled singing up to her room. "Oh, that will be joyful, joyful, joyful. Oh, that will be joyful. To meet to part no more." Then she opened the letter. She read the last lines with unseeing eyes. The first lines were branding themselves into her soul. She folded the brief sheet with deliberation and slowly put it back into the envelope. Then the color began to fall out of her face. Her eyes smoldered, glowed, then suddenly blazed. "He is sorry, I am tired waiting." Something warm, like a lifting tide of heat, was rising just below her breastbone. It rose, and surged, until she gasped, and cried out hoarsely, "If I think it over, I'll be ashamed, will I?" Couldn't respect himself? What about me respecting myself?
And the intolerable wave of heat still rose, swelling and bursting until it choked her. She was strangling.
She clutched at her throat, then flung out clenched hands. "He can't let me marry him? It's a long time for me to wait. I must make up my mind to it. I hate him, I want to kill him, I want to tear him. What did I tell him? To come and take me. And he doesn't want me?
And Nanny knows I told him to come, and Miss White and Uncle know it.
And they will know he didn't want me. Oh, how could I have told him I wanted him? I must kill him. I must kill myself." Her wild outpouring of words was without sense or meaning to her. She shuddered violently. Something crimson seemed to spread before her eyes, but the pallor of her face was ghastly. She began to pace up and down the room. Once she unfolded the letter, and glancing again at those moderate words, laughed loudly. "His," she said. "I told him I was his. I must have been out of my head. Well, I'll think it over. I'll think it over. He needn't worry about that. Oh, I could kill myself. And I told Cherry Pie I was going to be." She could not speak the word. She stood still and gasped for breath. The paroxysm was so violent, and so long in coming to its height before there could be any ebb, that suddenly she reeled slightly. A grey mist seemed to roll up out of the corners of the room. She sank down on the floor, crumpling up against her bed. When she opened her eyes, the mist had gone, and she felt very stiff and a little sick. "Why, where am I?" she said aloud. "What's the matter with me?" Then, dully, she remembered David's letter. "I was so angry I fainted," she thought, in listless astonishment. For the moment she was entirely without feeling, neither angry, nor wounded, nor ashamed. Then, little by little, the dreadful wave, which had ebbed, began to rise again. But now it was cold, not hot. She said to herself, quietly, that she would write to David Ritchie, and tell him she had thought it over, and that neither she nor her money was his, or any further concern of his. He needn't trouble himself. There would be no more imprudence. Oh, fool! Fool! A modest fool! To have told him he could have her for the taking, and he said it was long for her to wait. It was an unbearable recollection. His, she had said, soul and body. She saw again the written words that she had kissed, and she had an impulse to tear the flesh of the lovely young body she had offered this man, and he had declined. His, she blushed until she had to put her cold hands on her cheeks and forehead to ease the scorch. The modesty which a great and simple moment had obliterated came back with intolerable sharpness. By and by she got on her feet and dragged herself to a chair. She looked very wan and languid. For the moment the fire was out. It had burned up precious things. "I'll write to him tomorrow," she thought. And through the cold rage she felt a hot stab of satisfaction. Her letter, a rather different letter, this time, would make him suffer. But not enough. Not enough. She wished she could make him die, as she was dying. But she could not write at that moment. The idea of taking up a pen turned her sick with the remembrance of what her pen had written 3 days before. Instead of writing, she would go out and walk, and walk, and walk, and think how she could punish him, how she could kill him. Where should she go? Never mind. Anywhere, anywhere. Just let her get out, let her be alone, where nobody could speak to her. How could she ever speak to people again? To Miss White, who was down in the dining room, now, planning for the wedding. To Nanny, who knew that David had been summoned, and who must be told that he refused to come. To Blair, who would guess. She paused, remembering that she was angry with Blair. There was a perceptible instant before she could recollect why. When she did, she felt a pang of relief in her agony of humiliation. Blair, whatever else he was a man who could love a woman. It occurred to her that the girl Blair loved would not be thought immodest if she showed him how much she loved him. She began to put on her things to go out, and as she fastened her hat she looked at herself in the glass. I have a wicked sort of face, she thought, with a curious detachment from the situation which was almost that of an outside observer. She packed a small handbag, and then opened her purse to see if she had money enough to carry out a vague plan of going somewhere to spend the night, to get away from people. It was noon when she went downstairs. In the hall she called to Miss White that she was going out. "But it's just dinner time, my lamb," Miss White called back from the dining room, "and I must talk to you about." I want to see Nanny," Elizabeth said, in a smothered voice. It occurred to her that, later, she would go and tell Nanny that she had broken her engagement. It would be a satisfaction to do that, at any rate. "Oh, you're going to take dinner with her?" Miss White said, peering out into the hall. "Well, tell her to come in this afternoon and let us talk things over. There is so much to be done between now and the wedding," Cherry Pie fretted happily. "Wedding," Elizabeth said to herself, then slipped back the latch of the front door. "I shan't come back until tomorrow." "Oh, my lamb," Miss White remonstrated, "I must ask you some questions about the wedding." Then she remembered more immediate questions. "Is your satchel packed? Have you plenty of clean pocket handkerchiefs? Elizabeth, be careful not to take cold, and ask Nanny how many teaspoons she can lend us." The door slammed. It seemed to Elizabeth that she could never look Cherry Pie in the face again. She had a frantic feeling that if she could not escape from that intolerable insistence on the wedding, she would die. In the street, the mere cessation of Miss White's joyous twittering was a relief. Well, she must go where she could be alone. She walked several blocks before she thought of Willis's. It would take at least 2 hours to get there, and she could think things over without interruption. She would think how she could save her self-respect before Miss White and her uncle and Nanny, and she would also think of some dreadful way, some terrible way to punish David Ritchie. Yes, she would walk out to Willis's. "Elizabeth," someone said, at her elbow, and with a start she turned to see Blair. As they looked at each other, these two unhappy beings, each felt a faint pity for the other. Blair's face was haggard. Elizabeth's was white to the point of ghastliness, but there was a smudge of crimson just below the glittering amber of her eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, shocked, "what is it? You are ill. What has happened?" "Nothing. I am tired." She was so unconscious of everything but the maelstrom realization that she hated David that she did not remember that the hesitating man beside her was under the ban of her displeasure. Her only thought was that she wished he would leave her to herself. "Dark day, isn't it?" Blair said, but his voice broke in his throat. "I think we are going to have rain," Elizabeth answered, mechanically. She was perfectly unaware of what she said, for at that moment she saw, on the other side of the street, the friendly postman who 2 hours ago had brought her David Ritchie's insult. Now, his empty pouch over his shoulder, he was trudging back to the post office. Against the clamoring fury of her thoughts and the instant vision of David's letter, Blair's presence was no more to her than the brush of a wing across the surface of a torrent. As for Blair, he was dazed, and then ecstatic. She had not sent him away. She was perfectly matter of fact. "I think we are going to have rain." She must have forgiven him. "May I walk home with you, Elizabeth?" he said breathlessly. "I'm not going home. I am just walking." "So am I," he said. He had got himself in hand by this time. Every faculty was alert. He had his chance to ask for pardon. "Come out to Mrs. Tidd's and have some pink ice cream. Elizabeth, do you remember the paper roses on those dreadful marble-top tables that were sort of semi-transparent?" Elizabeth half smiled. I had forgotten them. How horrid they were. With the surface of her mind she was conscious that his presence was a relief. It was like a veil between her and the flames. Blair, watching her furtively, said, "I'll treat. Come along, let's have a spree." "You always did do the treating," she said absently. Blair laughed. The primitive emotions are always naked, but how inevitably most of us try to cover them with the fig leaf of trivial speech, a laugh, perhaps, or a question about the weather. Somehow, in some way, the nakedness must be covered. So now, love and hate, walking side by side in Mercer's murky noon, were for the moment hidden from each other. Blair laughed and said he would make her treat for a change, and she replied that she couldn't afford it. At the toll house he urged again, with gay obstinacy. "Oh, come in. You needn't eat the stuff, but just for the fun of the thing, Mrs. Todd will be charmed to see us, I'm sure." Well, Elizabeth agreed. For a moment the vapid talk was like balm laid upon burnt flesh. Then suddenly she remembered how David had sprung up that snowy path to the toll house, to knock on the window and cry, "I've got her." Ah, he was a little too sure, a little too sure. She was not so easy to get as all that, not so cheap as he seemed to think, though she had offered herself, had even told him she was tired of waiting. And at home Cherry Pie was counting the teaspoons for the wedding breakfast. Blair heard that fierce intake of her breath, and quivered without knowing why. "Yes, let us go," Elizabeth said fiercely. At least this chuckling old woman should see that David had not got her. She should see her with Blair, and know that there were men in the world who cared for her, if David Ritchie did not. Mrs. Todd was not at home, perhaps, if she had been. But instead of the big, motherly old figure, beaming at them from the toll house door, a slatternly maid servant said her mistress was out. "We ain't doing much cream now," she said, wrapping her arms in her apron and shivering. "It's too cold. I ain't got anything but vanilla." "We'll have vanilla, then," Blair said, in his rather courtly way, and the girl, opening the door of the saloon, scurried off. "By Jove," said Blair, "I believe these are the identical blue paper roses, look at them." She sat down wearily. "I believe they are," she said, and began to pull off her gloves. Outside in the toll house garden the frosted stems of last summer's flowers stood upright in the snow. She remembered that Mrs. Tidd's geraniums had been glowing in the window that winter day when David had shouted his triumphant news. Probably they were dead now. Everything else was dead. Still the tissue paper star on the ceiling. Blair cried, gaily, "Yes, everything is just the same." And indeed, when the maid, glancing with admiring eyes at the handsome gentleman and the cross-looking lady, put down on the semi-translucent marble top of the table 2 tall glasses of ice cream, each capped with its dull and dented spoon, the past was completely reproduced. As the frowsy little waitress left them, they looked at the pallid, milky stuff, and then at each other, and their individual preoccupations thinned for a moment. Blair laughed. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "You don't expect me to eat it, I hope? I won't make you eat it. Let's talk." But Elizabeth took up her gloves. "I must go, Blair." He pushed the tumblers aside and leaned toward her. One hand gripped the edge of the table until the knuckles were white, the other was clenched on his knee. "Elizabeth," he said, in a low voice, "have you forgiven me?" "Forgiven you? What for?" she said absently, then remembered and looked at him indifferently. "Oh, I suppose so. I had forgotten. I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't loved you. You know that." She was silent. "Do you hate me for loving you?" On Elizabeth's cheeks the smudge of crimson began to flame into scarlet. "I don't hate you. I think you were a fool to love me. I think anybody is a fool to love anybody." In a flash Blair understood. She had quarreled with David? It seemed as if all the blood in his body surged into his throat. He felt as if he was suffocating, but he spoke quietly. "Don't say I was a fool. Say I am a fool, if you want to. Because I love you still. I love you now. I shall never stop loving you." Elizabeth glanced at him with a sort of impersonal interest. So that was the way a man might love? "Well, I am sorry for you, Blair. I'm sorry, because it hurts to love people who don't love you. At least, I should think it did. I don't love anybody, so I don't know much about it." "You have broken with David," he said slowly. "How did you know?" she said, with a surprised look, then added listlessly, "Yes, I've done with David. I hate him." She looked blankly down at her muff and began to stroke the fur. It occurred to her that before going to Willis's she must see Nanny, or else she would have told Miss White a lie. Again the double working of her mind interested her. Rage, and a desire to be truthful, were like layers of thought. She noted this, even while she was saying again, between set teeth, "I hate him." "He has treated you badly," Blair said. "How did you know?" she said, startled. "I know David. What does a man like David know about loving a woman? He would talk his theories and standards to her, when he could be silent, in her arms. He flung out his hand and caught her roughly by the wrist. Elizabeth, for God's sake, marry me. Illustration. Elizabeth, marry me. He had risen and was leaning toward her, his fingers gripped her wrist like a trap, his breath was hot against her neck, his eyes glowed into hers. Marry me, Elizabeth. The moment was primal, the intensity of it was like a rapier thrust, down through her fury to the quick of womanly consciousness. She shrank back. Don't, she said, faintly, don't. For one instant she forgot that she hated David. Instantly he was tender. Dearest, dearest, I love you. Be my wife, Elizabeth. I have always loved you, always, don't you remember? He was kneeling beside her, lifting the hem of her skirt and kissing it, murmuring crazy words, but he did not touch her, which showed that the excuse of passion was not yet complete. And indeed it was not, for somewhere in the tumult of his mind he was defending himself, perhaps to his God. I have the right. It's all over between them. Any man has the right now. Then, aloud, Elizabeth, I love you. I shall love you forever. Marry me. Now. Tonight. When he said that, it was as if he had struck his God upon the mouth, for the accusing voice ceased. And when it ceased, he no longer defended himself. Elizabeth looked at him, dazed. No, I know you don't care for me, now, he said. Never mind that. I will teach you to care. I will teach you, he whispered, the meaning of love. He couldn't teach you. He doesn't know it himself. He doesn't, he was at a loss for a word. Some instinct gave him the right one, want you. It was the crack of the whip. She answered it with a look of hate. But still she was silent. You love him, he flung at her. I do not. I hate him, hate him, hate him. I wish he were dead in this room, so I could trample on him. Even in the scorch of that insane moment, Blair Maitland flinched at such a declaration of hate. Hate like that is the left hand of love. He had sense enough left in his madness to know that, and he could have killed David because he was jealous of such precious hate. You'll get over that, he assured her. Neither of them saw in such an assurance the confession that he knew she loved David still. And still his smitten God was silent. You hate him because he slighted you, Blair said, stammering with passion. But for God's sake, Elizabeth, show him that you hate him. Since he despises you, despise him. Will you let him slap you in the face, and still love him? I do not love him. They were both standing. Elizabeth, staring at him with unseeing eyes, seemed to be answering some fierce interrogation in her own thought. What? Was this the way to kill David Ritchie? That it would kill her, too, never occurred to her. If it had occurred to her, it would have seemed worthwhile, well worthwhile. Then why do you let him think you love him? Blair was insisting, in a violent whisper, why do you let him think you are under his heels still? Show him you hate him, if you do hate him. Marry me, that will show him. They were standing, now, facing each other, love and hate. Love, radiant, with glorious eyes, with beautiful parted lips, with outstretched hands that prayed, and threatened, and entreated, come. I must have you, God, I must. And hate, black-browed, shaking from head to foot, with dreadful set stare, and hands clenched and trembling, hands that reached for a dagger to thrust, and thrust again. Hands reaching out and finding the dagger in that one, hot, whispered word, come. Yes, that would show him. When? She said, trembling. And he said, now. Elizabeth flung up her head with a look of burning satisfaction. Come, she said, and laughing wildly, she struck her hand into his.